Good morning to everybody that's on the line already. I see we already have over 50 people in this meeting. We expect a few more to edge in. I hope wherever you find yourself, you're warm and comfortable. Looked at the weather forecast and it looks as if this weekend and the public holiday is going to be cold weather for all of us. So hopefully this workshop is the right thing, will leave you with a warm feeling. But that you're also finding yourself with a mug of coffee or tea in your hand and that you are comfortable. I want to introduce you to the facilitators today. Manal, by the way, is going to drive the slides for us. He's the person behind this. And then the actual facilitators would be myself, Maurits Pretorius. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at PASA, and then Gita Erling, which I'm sure you all know, and you'll see her there on camera. Welcome, Gita. She's our CEO, as you all know. And then you also will see on camera Cosmo Pereola. She's our CFO. Welcome, Cosmo. Now, between the three of us, we will handle the day and facilitate the day. Let's then just talk a little bit about the objectives of the day and perhaps just the normal virtual etiquette and things like that. Let's deal with the rules for virtual engagement first. So as I mentioned to you, we've got over 200 slides to deal with, but we want the session to be fast-paced, and the idea of today is really orientation. So we're going to point out certain things that will allow you to orientate yourself with regards to the design. This is, by the way, a request that we received from many people after all the sign-offs and all the detail that has been dealt with. And yes, we are edging closer and closer to the final report that we want to present to the SARP. But a number of people asked, give us just a overarching holistic view on what we've now decided, where do we stand, what's the implications of all of this. And that is really what today is all about. It's a orientation session. But to the points being made on the virtual engagement etiquette, let's make it interactive. Ask your questions, engage with us in the chat boxes. Please put your camera on when you speak. When you don't speak, please mute. There's nothing as difficult to handle than somebody's mic that's on and you have to scroll through over. I see we've more or less 70 people already, through 70 people to find out whose mic is on. So just be aware of that. Raise your hand when you want to speak or make a comment or engage with us. But the idea is today it's orientation, but also engagement. We will provide this pack to all of you. So the idea of the pack is to of the session is for us to kind of orientate you with regards to the pack, so that you can read the pack from a perspective where you know how to interpret certain things, what it means, what's the implications, and such. But all in all, thank you for being here this morning, and have fun with us, and let's learn together about this this PIB. Let's then move on to the workshop objectives and the agenda. As I've mentioned, the idea is orientation. Um, Perhaps I have to then ask everybody not to debate the merits of material that has already been signed off. We don't want to relitigate or debate it. I think we would rather like to engage with the implications of that. So what does it mean for all of us? We then want to walk through as much of the content as we possibly can, as fast as possible. We've summarized a lot of that for you, so it's to make it easy. We're not going to stick with all the slides in detail. So also be conscious of the fact that from our side, we don't want to create a death by PowerPoint experience this morning. So the idea is the content of the PIB, what it means, what's the changes that will then come, or what's the implications of the PIB. And lastly, I think from your own organization perspective, how will this changes then impact your organization? What does it mean, both in terms of participation, governance, and a number of other things, the membership categories, etc. So let's look at the agenda then for this morning. Over and above the welcome and objectives, which I think I've dealt with mostly now, we are then going to actually move into a session with Gita that will set the scene for us. There's about 8 critical slides that I think highlights for us the reason, first of all, why the PIB has been created, why we embarked on this joint journey. What are the key changes in the PIB? And then I think she'll move on to the design principles, just to recap a few of those critical ones, so that you understand how it actually took further form in some of the further design elements and modules. Moving on from there, I will deal with functions and scope. And then we'll have a short comfort break. Then we'll move on to recognition, and then the inner workings of the PIB in the form of the mandate, and also the recognition that we would receive from the SARB, and then membership and governance, which I think is a critical element for all of us. We'll have another comfort break then. Then I'm going to hand over to Cosmo to deal with funding and other obligations. And then I think we will end off with a session where we're going to give you a few examples of organizations and what the PIB would mean from such an organization's perspective. So we'll deal with a typical PSP, a bank, a typical payments operator, and one or two others. That leaves us also then time for questions and closeout, which Gita will handle. But I do want to invite everybody as we progress in this discussion today, as we move through the orientation. If the question comes, put it in the chat box, raise your hand, let's deal with it, rather than leave it to the end. I think it's more relevant and more pertinent if we deal with it right there at that point in time. Good. I think with that, I'm actually handing over to you, Gita, and again, welcome everybody and thank you for being here.
Good morning, everybody. I know we're covering territory that we've all largely seen, but I must say that when I went back and reviewed this in preparation for today, I realized just how far the journey we've come is and how much detail we've worked through. So Please bear with us when we work through the material. Ask questions if we go too fast over some of it, or if we brush over something that you think is an important point. And maybe just to understand that what we're covering here is what has been signed off. Where we touch on material that isn't signed off, we'll make it very clear to you. And of course, this is the high-level design. There's a huge amount of detail that will still come out as we go into the transition planning and designing the actual operating model of the new entity. But now back to the very, very beginning. So why are we actually doing all of this? And thanks, Manal. You can jump to the next slide. The next slide, which is the problem statement, is also the opening statement that we have for the design principles, for those of you who are familiar with them. And they remind us that the national payment system is made up of interoperable payment system and the associated network effects. And these promote the national policy objectives around safety, security, interoperability, efficiency, competition, financial inclusion. The purpose really and the ultimate reason for a payments industry body is to ensure interoperability so that your payment can go from one place to another place without any questions asked, so that you can have a single POS device sitting on your desk, so that you can use one QR code as opposed to having 7 different QR codes, depending on who you bank with in order to initiate a payment. And so the real root cause purpose of what the PIB is supposed to do and what PASA does today is to protect the interoperable middle mile. It's to protect fragmentation of the systems, of the payment systems, to maintain interoperability and to get the benefits of interoperability. So then why are we going through this massive effort to design a new entity in the first place? And I'm not going to be quite as eloquent as Tim was on this in our opening sessions, but PASA has served its purpose exceptionally well over the last 25 plus years. We have a payment system that's interoperable. It's undergoing significant modernization efforts, and we take for granted that it works safely, securely, and does what it needs to. There's been a lot of debate over the past 5 or 6 years about, is there actually a purpose for a PASA or a PIB indeed in managing the payment system? And after all these debates and all of these discussions, we've jointly come to the conclusion that yes, there is, because that interoperable middle mile must be protected, but it needs to be more inclusive and involve a broader constituency of members, because there are so many parties who play an active role within payments. And therefore, the next question was, well, why don't you just open up PASA to everybody else? And the very strongly expressed view from the Reserve Bank is you don't want everybody else to be second cousins who've kind of been offered a seat at the table late in the process. Let's rather get everybody together, get the full community together and co-design what could be a workable and pragmatic payments industry body that fulfills the objectives put out by the Reserve Bank, which are around interoperability, collaboration and cooperation, looking after the policy objectives and making sure that the good of the national payment system is protected. So that is why are we even doing this? It feels weird to be discussing that, I don't know, something like 8-9 months into the process, but it's a very important starting point. And ultimately, all of this is around protecting the South African economy and the good of the country, because payments are the lifeblood. It's how the blood or the money of the economy flows. We have to work, and we have to work efficiently in order to support the South African economy. So there's a very strong element flowing through all of this around the greater good of the country. Thank you, Manal. Okay, so what context is this happening in? And as we all know, this is happening within the context of regulatory changes, which will take place over some time. If we go to the next slide, Manal, this slide is put together on the basis of a discussion we had with Tim in one of the workshops on the 8th of December last year. It was very shortly after first drafts of the Conduct of Financial Institutions, together with the consequential amendments of the National Payment System Act, were released. And I call them first drafts because although the coffee bill had been very extensively discussed, it was the first time that we saw the payments element. So Tim joined us to explain that actually the PIB is completely consistent with the changes that are coming to the regulation and what the purpose and the roadmap for the regulation is. So What the Reserve Bank envisages is perhaps making 3 sets of changes to the National Payments System Act. The initial thinking was that the Act was going to be revised, and there was a policy paper to that extent, I think in 2016 or 2018, and nothing has changed really from where that policy paper started, except the means of which this is going to be implemented. So the first set of changes are planned for this year. They arise out of consequential amendments from the Coffee Bill, which defines, and we have a slide later in the content, a whole bunch of new payments-related activities which will be licensed by the South African Reserve Bank and in most instances also by the Financial Sector Conduct Authority. So what the first set of changes are going to do for the National Payment System Act is they will bring in these new categories of parties who are going to be licensed. And in effect, it's anybody who is seen to provide some kind of payments related service. It's to give the Reserve Bank the ability to move from regulating according to your entity type. So are you a bank? Are you a non-bank? Are you a settlement bank? Are you a clearing bank? To move away from that and to actually regulate you on your activity. So no matter who you are, you should be regulated the same according to what you do within the payments environment. And then the third urgent element that they're looking at for this year is around giving the governors the sufficient power to designate new areas into regulation as and when the world changes. This is the start of the process. At this stage, the sponsor bank model stays exactly the same. Access to clearing and settlement remains pretty much as it is. And if you want to become a clearing participant without being a bank, you would have to go through a designation process. There's a second set of changes that will come through the so-called Omnibus Bill, which is around amending broader financial sector regulation. Those consequential amendments, my understanding is, will start to look at access to the payment system and our current sponsor bank model. If at the end of those changes, there are further changes required to the National Payment System Act, then those changes will be made to the Act itself. I just want to reiterate what I said at the beginning, and which Tim has very often repeated. There is no contradiction between the changes in the regulation and the PIB design process. In fact, in my view, running the two concurrently has been very useful because in some ways we've adapted the PIB to what we know the regulation is going to do, and it has actually played out the other way in that some of what the PIB has recognized it needs may actually and probably will have impact on the final wording of the regulation. So in my view, the concurrent processes, although they've added complexity and work, a lot of work for everyone at the same time, have actually been very good for the industry. So that's why we're doing this whole big exercise. And from my side, a huge thank you to everybody who's been involved so far. It's been a huge journey. It's been many hours of workshops and interaction. It's been hundreds of pages of content. And it's very clear from the feedback that we get that everybody has applied their mind and gotten a good grip of the content. So thank you again to everybody who's been involved. Thanks, Manal. Okay. So this is a summary section. Before we go into any of the detail, treat this as an executive summary of what is actually going to change in the PIB world and with the new changes in the Act relative to what PASA does today. And I think we've picked out 6 dimensions where there are going to be material changes. This summary you will see play out in all of the later detail, but these are probably the most critical points for you to understand. So thanks, Manal. So the first one is around licensing. Today, PASA effectively sets the criteria by which banks have, and the hoops banks have to jump through in order to become participants in a given clearing or settlement stream. Beyond that, once the Reserve Bank has designated a clearing participant, they have to jump through the same hoops in order to become a PASA member, in order to become a participant in a payment stream. Further, today, PASA licenses the the PCH system operators, so the people who clear transactions between banks, BankServe, Visa, MasterCard, and Straight, are licensed within the PASA environment. PASA authorizes system operators and it registers third-party payments providers, TPPs. All of that activity around registering, licensing, authorizing will move to the Reserve Bank. And will be shared with the FSCA as well, to my earlier comments in many instances. So the responsibility for licensing parties who play in the payment space will no longer sit with the PIB, it will sit with the regulator, which we believe is entirely appropriate because you move away from the environment where existing participants license new participants. It does have some interesting implications, because it means that participation in the payment system then is by grace of your license, not by your agreeing to a multilateral clearing agreement, as is the case today. So the whole legal framework underpinning the environment potentially changes because of that. Given that the Reserve Bank will probably license Visa, MasterCard, and BankServe, for example, in the card environment, the clearing participants would obviously choose who they directly deal with, but the expectation would be that the PIB makes sure that it makes no difference, that card transactions, whether across Visa, MasterCard, or BankServe, still flow through all of those parties. Okay. The implementation path for this is going to be done with the Reserve Bank. So we have agreed with them, and as part of the changing legislation, there will be a transitionary plan. The second is the regulatory recognition for the payment industry body. So today, as you probably know, PASA is recognized as the Payment System Management Body, which is an animal of the National Payment System Act. That is going to fall away. But based on, and we'll get to it later today, requests from this community, the Reserve Bank has acknowledged and understood that there is still a need to license the PIB, specifically so that local rules can override scheme rules, probably is the most critical point. And what the Reserve Bank is going to do is it's going to license the PIB itself, and it's going to force all participants who get payment licenses to be members of a PIB. So that means that the PIB rules will in fact be binding on members by the fact that members have to be members as part of their licensing criteria in order to provide payment systems, payment services, which again questions the need for multilateral PCH agreements to bind members because they'll be bound in other ways already. So potentially the whole PCH legal construct will fall away in this new world, but obviously it can't be replaced by a vacuum. And when we get into the details of how the rules work, we'll talk about how that gets potentially split up. Thank you. The third change, Manal, if you don't mind flipping slides, is to the rules themselves. So the closest analogy for those of you who are involved in the PASA world today is the way that the card rules work today. So each of the card operators or schemes sets their own rules, but there are central rules which enforce interoperability across those various scheme and operator rules that ensure that transactions are commonly used and interoperable within the South African market, and that South African specifics are in play. And that model is going to become the practice for everything else. So scheme rules will move to scheme operators, clearing rules will move to PSOs, so PCH system operators, so clearing operators, and those parties will manage their rules. Interoperability rules, however, ensuring that the interoperability holds, that it's not fragmented across these various commercial entities who will have the ability to set rules, sits with the PIB. And in its licensing, the Reserve Bank will be licensing the PIB to write rules which supersede scheme and operator rules, thereby giving it the ability to enforce interoperability and South African standards in terms of what interoperability means. This has some quite big implications in the EFT, debit check type environments, We are building RPP, kind of moving towards this model where the scheme is actually owned by BankServe and the clearing rules are owned by BankServe, but then there are interoperability rules that sit in the center. And the theory there is that if BankServe today provides real-time payments, another PCH operator or PSO or clearing operator, whatever we want to call them, walks into the country tomorrow. So VocaLink decides they also want to participate in RPP. They should be able to take the interoperability rules and start operating interoperably with BankServe in providing clearing services for real-time payments, and it should make no difference to anybody except those who choose to connect directly. Okay, so that means we are going to have to sit down and effectively unbundle the rules and the product development around the payment streams and move it to the right place. My sense is that's not going to be an overnight process. It will be done on a prioritized basis. There may be some legacy cases where it makes no sense to move rules or scheme ownership because the system's not going to be around for much longer. There may be some where we want to resolve issues before they move. So this will be a very carefully agreed, articulated, and involving everybody process of how this gets done. By the same token, the clearing rules for bonds, money market, securities clearing, etc., which operation is performed by Straight, will move to Straight. Straight will have to be a PIB member because they will be a clearing service provider, and the PIB will still have the ability to write interoperability rules that supersede Straight rules and to make sure that the appropriate risk governance and interoperability as applicable applies in this case. So that is the third and probably the biggest in practical terms change. The fourth change, Manal, if you don't mind flipping slides, and I think I might have a bit of delay, is to membership. So we've talked about this already. Today, you can only be a member of PASA if you are a clearing or settlement participant. That means most of our members are banks, although there are a few non-bank members who have been designated into the system in various ways. The complete change here is that anybody who's licensed to provide payment services will have to be a member of the PIB. And further, there is still considerable debate about allowing voluntary members in as well. So those who have a significant stake in how payments play out in this country, giving them the opportunity to be members of the PIB themselves. This is also a big implementation piece. There's going to be a new legal entity. We do have sign-off that it's going to be a not-for-profit company. So that sign-off was achieved in the last couple of weeks. It will have a new memorandum of incorporation, a new board, new members, and new member structure. So an entirely new entity. The PASA member portal is being updated to accommodate self-registration of entities and representatives. It'll be reskinned to allow a much broader community of parties access. And there will have to be enhanced onboarding processes, billing processes, and due diligence processes to be designed as part of the transition work from PASA to the PIB. Thanks, Manal. Settlement. Now, we've included the settlement rules under the PIB, but in fact, this is a separate stream. So the Reserve Bank, as I'm sure you all know, runs the settlement systems for South Africa. So all of the obligations that are created when you use your card from one bank to draw money from another bank's ATMs are expunged through the accounts of the Reserve Bank through a settlement system that is run by the Reserve Bank. And we sit in the slightly, and there are very good historical reasons for it, but we sit in the slightly strange environment where PASA writes the rules for that settlement system. And PIB or no PIB, we had reached agreement with the Reserve Bank that they should manage the rules for their own system. And that will be changing over time. We will run this as a separate project. We've already started work on it, already starting to consider the structures that would support it. We will involve the broader industry who are involved in settlement because there's quite a lot of complexity in this conversation. And as you'll see in some of the later content, we don't even know what it means. You know, what are settlement rules versus high value payments versus the operational elements that go with, for example, cash settlements. So a lot of work to be done here, but not something that's explicitly part of the PIB design. but a change that we do need to be aware of. And then, thank you, Manal. The final change is that, and you will see this when Moritz goes through the PIB function that has been agreed and signed off. There are functions in the PIB that change relative to what PASA does today. So there are some things that PASA does that the PIB will no longer do, and we've talked about some of those. So managing the scheme, for example, debit check and RTC, which it does today. Managing the clearing rules that will move to the clearing operators, and a few other things like incident and crisis management. So PASA today does a lot of incident management. The expectation would be that the clearing operator would do that within the auspices of frameworks and standards set by the PIB. And again, Moritz will talk to that when he gets to the functional update. There are also expectations, though, that the PIB will do functions that PASA doesn't do today. And those include a number of things, but probably the most material are compliance monitoring. And you'll see one of the design principles says that the PIB must be able to enforce its rules. And then the other one is creating a central MIS capability, so that there is a central industry view of what the payment systems are doing. There are implications, obviously, to this, because this is, again, the moving of functions and moving parts between parties, and of course there can be no impact. So as part of the transition planning, there will have to be a budget to say how is this going to work, and a plan to say how do you hand over the functions, as we've already discussed. The PIB costs will decline relative to PASA in line with functions that move out. That is one of the commitments that we have made as part of the funding work, the funding principles, which we will get to later today. And my expectation is, and we've touched on this before, that as part of the transition planning, we will come back to the community and say, this is the day one function and the day one budget of what the PIB is going to do. So day one, it's not necessarily going to do everything within the function and scope. In fact, there's no ways it could. Skills are too scarce in the industry. You're not going to be able to build that up. It's going to take time. So all of that will be engaged with the community to say, what does day one look like? And is everybody in agreement? And how is that supported from a budget and a structure point of view? And then the new functionalities and the handover to some extent of existing functionalities can be project managed as and when, even once the PIB is up and running. We will go through an exercise of reviewing all the PASA projects to say which should stay within the PIB structure and which should move to an individual clearing operator. It is absolutely critical that there can be no impact, though, of these changes to the functioning of the payment system. It has to continue to operate safely, efficiently, as it does today. And the major projects which are running cannot be slowed down or put at risk because of any of this. And that also plays out in the design principles, which we are going to spend a few minutes on now. So that is the summary of the major changes. We'll get into the detail of how all of those come into effect as we go through the detail today of the design itself. I'd like to stop here and ask if there are any clarifying questions. Because there's quite a lot in that. And again, as I say, we'll get into more detail of how it plays out. Okay. Then what we're going to do now is actually, so that the section we've just done now was an interpretation of what do the design elements that are signed off mean. What we're going to do now is actually go into the design work itself. And for those of you who remember September last year, we started off with design principles, which are really intended to be the North Star of the design. And reading them through again last night, and as I have done regularly through this process, you can see that the design principles are very accurately reflected in the design. I'm just going to take the question, Isak, about will the PASA be replaced by the PIB? And the answer is absolutely. So the way we're thinking things are going to work is we will complete the design work once everybody's signed off on all of it, and we think we are relatively close to the point where we can bring the final content to the community for final sign off at the workshop that's planned on the 30th of June. Once that design is signed off by everybody, it will go to the Reserve Bank for their review. And while they're doing that, we will start working on a transition plan. So how do you move from the association, which PASA is today, into this new not-for-profit company that'll be the PIB in future? That obviously has to be coupled with the changes in regulation, and there are various scenarios. So the regulation could land before the PIB could land before the regulation. So there's quite a lot of complexity in planning that transition work and logistics. Once the design is signed off and the transition plan is signed off by, at a minimum, the Reserve Bank and PASA Council today, then we would start the process of implementing this new legal entity. And at some point when everybody is happy, PASA will stop functioning and the PIB will take over. So absolutely, we're not planning on incurring the costs of trying to run two of these entities at the same time. Don't know if there are any further questions. And you can put up your hands and ask as well. You don't have to type. Okay. So back to the design principles. They were also to try and create the parameters within which the design could work. So there were certain almost underlying principles by the nature of where the South African national payment system is today, what the regulation does today, what the future regulation will do, that did impact on what were possible design parameters within the South African context. David, I'll come back to your question now. And it was within those parameters, and the design principles were designed to kind of give you the outline of those parameters within which we could work. They're intended to give guidance around potentially difficult topics and also to provide a basis for diffusing or resolving conflicting viewpoints. David, in terms of the timelines, if we can get final content or sufficient agreement on the remaining open items that we can present the final content for sign-off at the end of June, we will then be in a position to get the report itself to the Reserve Bank in September, remembering that we still have to have everybody go through the process of applying their mind to the content and signing off, and that we will be giving the broader community visibility of the report, not to sign off on the report because it's on sign-off content, but just to confirm that we haven't deviated from the content. We don't have a sense of the Reserve Bank timeline for review, but we're not overly worried because we have a sense of how much work we have to do in the planning phases. My gut feel is best case, everything going well, no hiccups, is mid next year. But that's a very optimistic, I think, view of what it would take to stand it up. And then a lot depends on how the legislation plays out. So please don't hold me to it. But if I had to do a thumbs up today, I would be kind of looking at a year's time. I heard somebody on mic. Does someone want to ask a question? Or unmute? Okay. Okay, so I am going to then spend the next 15 or so minutes. My best guess as to what can frustrate the process. You ask very difficult questions. So we could still fail to reach agreement on one or two critical items entirely. And that would put us in quite an interesting position. I don't think we're there yet, and we should have clarity on that in the next week or two. So that's the sign-off piece. The Reserve Bank could have concerns about the design process or about the design report we give to them, although we've tried to mitigate that through regular engagements with them. We've shared the design principles and have at least verbal confirmation of no objection to the design principles. which means there shouldn't be material issues with the rest of the content. And as I say, we have been working very closely with the Reserve Bank, updating them monthly on this process, but they could want changes made to the design, in which case we would have to come back to the plenary. And the other thing that I think could happen is that when we get into the transition planning and we actually map the target operating model of the new entity and the details of the new structures, that could show us that we made mistakes in some of the design. And then we would again have to come back to this community and get sign off on any changes we make to the design. And then we have committed to this community that the final budget will come back. Because we don't really know what it looks like. There's too much uncertainty. We don't know how many members will be paying. We don't know what the target operating model looks like. So we have committed that the final budget will come back for approval again, and that could also create roadblocks. Disagreement between the existing PASA bank principal members. I must say we've worked very closely with the banks and the Banking Association in this process. We've obviously had some very robust debates in areas where we've disagreed and changes have been made. And we've negotiated some points very carefully, as we have with many of the rest of you. So the broader community has also given us some very good input, and we've made changes as a consequence of the feedback from everybody. I really hope we are beyond the point where the critical, I think there's one critical item still on the table that has to be resolved. But having come this far, I would be devastated if that becomes a final kind of sticking point. So I must say that the existing banks have really engaged with this process. They've thrown massive capacity against it. They've been very open to the changes, accepting of the fact that there is a need for change, and worked very closely with us. So yes, it could happen, but you'll notice I'm not flagging it as the highest likelihood. But I think we're going to have a few more robust debates when we get into the entity itself. So, but that's the purpose, to have the discussions around the table, to understand all of the technical and risk dynamics, and to come to solutions that work. So that's our bread and butter. Everyone happy with that as an articulation of the risks? There is another risk, and that is one we cannot allow, which is that this change in any way impacts the payment systems. So we have to be very aware that whatever we have to do has to be done within the context of the broader environment. The cost of memberships, we will talk to that, Isak, in the funding section, which Cosmo will cover later this morning. Okay. So then on to the design principles themselves. And Manal, we can move on to the next slide, please. What we have done, okay, so the first piece is the preamble, and we've already talked to that. That just explains why we need to do this, why it's important for the economy, and why it's important that you have a well-functioning payment industry body with the right expertise, the right capacity, the right processes and procedures in order to support the good functioning and interoperability of South African payments, with obviously the appropriate regulatory recognition. What we've done after that is that, and Manal, you can jump to the next slide, is we have bucketed the design principles into different categories. So there's a membership category, there's a governance category, there's this rights and obligations category. Initially, we had put the rights and obligations with everything else, but this became the hot topic and probably the heart of what we're trying to do. For those of you who listened to Deputy Governor Kuben Naidu's presentation last Friday, and it is available 2 Fridays ago, and it is on our website if you haven't seen it. It's worth listening to, because this is the crux of it all. How do you balance the rights and obligations of all of the various different parties, and given the disparate investment that the various parties have made into the environment? So we pulled all of those into a central point. We have numbered the design principles so we can reference them when we need to. I'm going to obviously not read through all of these. You'll have the pack. But the important point about this is inclusivity, equitable outcomes, activity-based participation, robust consultation. So for those who don't necessarily have a seat at the table because they're not involved in that activity, but if they are impacted by that activity, must at least still be consulted. Making sure that there are adequate controls so that decision making is balanced across the various parties, making sure that the parties who are making decisions do actually have skin in the game and a stake in the decision which they are making. So you can't have somebody who's not involved in clearing at all coming and telling the clearing participants how clearing should work. And making sure that decision-making powers are appropriately delegated. So that is the rights and obligations. As you can see, many of these could fit into another category, but we pulled them all into one place. Thanks, Manal. Then the mandate. And it's quite interesting now that we have clarity on the mandate, which we will cover, which I've touched on already, but we'll cover in more detail later. Is the point that there is the necessity to look to national policy objectives and member interests, and I think we have managed to balance that in the design. So I'm very pleased we've managed to walk that tightrope, which caused a lot of unhappiness when we first looked at the principles. And all of this is around policy objectives, that it's going to be the interests of the NPS and the interests of members. It's got to create the environment where we can have the robust and difficult debates in order to get to the right outcomes. That we cannot totally ignore what's happening regionally and globally because of the impact that has on domestic South African standards, and therefore the need to have potentially an advocacy role in some of that work, and the fact that legal certainty needs to underpin any environment where value or risk is transferred by one party to another. So that is a very, very high level overview of the mandate principles. Thank you, Manal. The next one is membership. So we have said associations and individuals can hold membership. There've got to be different categories of membership, and we're going to cover this in a lot of detail later this morning to facilitate equitable and proportionate participation in rights and obligation. That members must see benefit for their participation. The mandatory membership as a result of the licensing conditions, and quite important to single house for all interoperable payment participants and for all service providers to prevent the fragmentation, to prevent potential fragmentation of the system. Thanks, Manal. Then some business and operating model principles. So the PIB itself must operate efficiently. It must automate and digitize to move from 30 members that PASA has today to the probably in excess of 300 that will be required in the new entity. Critically is the design principle 4.4. So the PIB must have the ability to adapt itself to remain relevant. So this design that we are doing is effectively a starting point. And then the PIB will have its own governance functions, it'll have its AGM, it'll have its board, and it will have to change and adapt itself to remain relevant going forward. So we can't pretend that what we're designing now is going to be the answer for 5 years' time. The structures must be appropriately capacitated with the right people, and the PIB itself must also be appropriately capacitated to run what is needed and to do it efficiently to the standards that are expected by the broader community. Thanks, Manal. Then some design principles around the transition. So
I see Gita disappeared off camera. Seems to be a problem on her side. Let's just give her a minute to come back.
Thanks, I'm back. I have no idea why I
There
got
we
so
go.
unceremoniously thrown out. There must be something here that's a problem. So the big point is we've got to continue with legal certainty in doing the transition from PASA to the PIB. We've got to manage continuity, maintain risk management, but we also at the same time need to encompass the new capabilities and processes. Because the transition is going to bring risk, it must be managed appropriately as a change program. And then, of course, the one that is really close to my heart is that we've got to create a safe environment for the people who sit in these functions. And I'm just going to spend a minute or so on this one, if you guys will bear with me. But, you know, the assets of PASA sit in its people, its expertise, its processes, and the IP in its rules, its policies, its constitutions, and its way of working. Now, obviously, the IP is well documented because the rules are documented, the processes and procedures are documented, but the expertise and experience and knowledge of the people is the core of what we need to protect in moving across to the PIB. And you will have all noticed that one of the reasons I've had a sense of urgency in this process is around the uncertainty that the process creates for the PASA people. So very important that we manage the change both within PASA, but also without PASA. Because the other thing that's become very clear to me in the last few months is just how big a change this is for everybody else. And so big focus needed on creating the safe transitioning environment for everybody who's involved. Thanks, Manal. And then finally, governance. So when we initially put the slide forward, we just simply put in the principle of adherence to King 4. What we did is we then filled that out in quite a lot more detail, and you will see that this stuff plays out very explicitly in the design functions that follow. So I am going to spend a couple of minutes on this. The first is that as far as King is concerned, board members act independently with unfettered discretion, due care, skill, and diligence. And this has been quite important. We'll talk about the board member appointment processes, in that board members must behave appropriately and act independently, irrespective of the constituency who appoints them. So that's probably one of the things we spent a lot of time discussing. Activities, processes, and decision-making must be transparent, legitimate, and fair, and ensure accountability. And you'll see that again in some of the consultation processes and decision-making processes that we outline under membership and governance. But at the same time, the board must have a membership inclusive approach. So it must have the right expertise, the right knowledge, the right skills that balances the legitimate needs, interests, and expectation of all members and stakeholders. And that is also a very important point that's played out in the board discussions. The board itself, as the ultimate governing body, has a fiduciary duty to act in the interests of the national payment system while also looking after the interests of the members. Board members must lead ethically, and to ensure the 4 pillars of good governance, which are ethical culture, good performance, effective control, so the risk piece, and legitimacy. And the board needs to be reflective of the various parties, but it must be balanced with independence, and we'll talk about that. And most importantly, it must be balanced in terms of knowledge, skills, experience, and independence. So those very important governance principles, which we have spent enormous amounts of time talking about and debating and saying, what does it mean in negotiating and defining various parts of the governance design.
Right, now we're getting into some of the meat of the new design. Let's look at functions and scope in particular. So this is now where we start to answer the question, so what will this PIB do? Now, starting with this slide, I think this is probably a very key slide for all of us. And the story about this slide is that we looked at several countries that has similar payments bodies, payments management bodies than PASA. And across all of those countries, we looked at what do they actually do? What would be the typical functions that you would see? And we've identified them and started to organize those functions along what we call a level 0, level 1, and a level 2 decomposition. And I think it's actually quite worthwhile just to stay with the slide for a moment. And on the highest level, in other words, on the green blocks that you see there at the top, to kind of almost fix the narrative for yourself to say, what does it mean? What's the story I'm telling myself about this aspect, about that aspect, and so on. And let's quickly just go through it on this slide, just to get the highest level view. If you look at payment system management, and remember, PASA even currently is a payment system management body. The story you should tell yourself is that the rule setting and all of those things associated with payments management is going to change. And it will resemble more of the card model that we currently have in South Africa, and less of the current PASA model that you would see more on the electronic side. What that means is that the PIB will be involved more in what we call interoperability rules and interoperability rule setting. And a lot of the scheme rules and such will migrate. Yes, it will be a process and an evolution over time. It's not going to all happen immediately, but there is going to be that migration of rules and that differentiation of rules. That's the important thing to kind of realize about the first column there. If you think about the second column, payment system operations, South Africa never followed a model where the payments industry body or the payments association also operated the system. So the tech, the operations was always in a different place. There were payment system operators appointed for those purposes. Now, in our case, that will continue. The story you should tell yourself is that the operators will get involved in more things. They will have to develop their own scheme rules. They will take accountability for their products, and they're not just a tech operator. They would be functioning both as an operator and run the scheme. When we move to the third column, industry support, the story you should tell yourself is that there will always be a number of things that somebody needs to do on behalf of the industry, like, for instance, education, capacity building, and so on. A lot of this will be picked up by the PIB, but there will be instances where other entities, and again, the operators, because as I've indicated, a lot moves to the operators, where the operators might have to pick up the accountability to, for instance, educate consumers out there about the functionality in a new system. When we move to the second last column, the project management, the story you should tell yourself is that there will always be elements of project management that will have to span more than one area, that may have to happen on the highest level, and that there will still be a project delivery capability in the PIB to do those kinds of projects. And then if we move to the last column, industry representation, it's important to remember that we are not a trade association. In other words, a place to lobby the interests of your particular industry, but it is a place to collaboratively and collectively respond when we are being asked to respond on, for instance, legislation, on certain payments matters, and so on. And we will always, as a new organization, have to then pull everybody together and ensure the collective response is well articulated and well catered for in this space. So that's the important, I think, stories and takeouts that you should have for yourself on this slide. Now let's go into this in a little bit more detail, and we will start on the first column here with the rules and the fact that the rules will change. And remember, the story here is it's more about interoperability rules, and a lot of the rules will actually, and a lot of the things PASA in the past that will actually be clearly sitting at the operator side. So let's look at the next slide then, because this is where I think we can give this story now some further meat. Try to take in both these columns at once. So if we then say interoperability rules on the one hand and scheme and operator rules on the other hand, what is it then? How can we then make the distinction between what the PIB will do and what the operators will do? So first of all, if you think about the scheme and the operators, they will determine the technical specifications. They would have those kinds of documents, own those kinds of documents. The job of the PIB would be to reference those common message standards. So once we've agreed, or as an industry concluded on a set of technical specifications which might include certain message standards and so on, the PIB's role is to be that kind of single place where you can come to, and we would know what would be the message standards being agreed, and we would be almost a bit of a standards authority, and we will be able to reference what sits where and what needs to happen where. Moving to the second line, obviously then the scheme and the operator would be involved in technical flows and technical rules, how these flows work, what messages are being used, and so on. What the PIB would do is look at it from a little bit of a higher level and say, let's agree, or let's kind of make clear what is mandatory and what is non-mandatory. What are the transactions types that you must do for the local market? What would be transaction types that would not apply in South Africa? We move to the third line then. The scheme and the operator would then define those message standards themselves. We would look at common definitions of elements impacting things like interchange in support of SARB work. We won't define the message standards. At most, the PIB could get involved in initiation layer type message standards, but most of the message standards would be defined by the operator or by the scheme. Let's look at security and fraud then. So the PIB's role is to ensure that there's a common management of fraud issues, i.e. there's a debit order abuse process, or there's a fraud system where we would have defined certain musts and have to do type elements. But the actual security standards would sit again with the PSO and with the scheme. Moving on then, if you think about consumer protection, I think the PIB's role is always to ensure adequate consumer protection. We will have to carry the consumer hat on behalf of some of the regulators, i.e. the FSCA. The commercial elements, including penalty charges, processing fees, all of those elements would sit with the PSO and the scheme. Next line then. If you look at the processes for changing rules and enhancing systems, obviously the PIB would be involved in those processes, would define those processes, but the actual product definitions and standards, including the user experience, or let's say there's a brand, how the brand must be used and so on, would sit with the scheme. We will not, as a PIB, get involved in any of that. If you then look at the scheme, you would understand, the scheme could be an international scheme, like a card scheme. The PIB would, as we currently do at PASA, continue to define local variations that could change some of the scheme rules even, or override some of the scheme rules. So there might be some overlaps to an extent with PIB rules, but the idea is for the PIB to basically make clear how this would apply in a local setup, and in that case may even supersede some of the scheme or the PSO rules. Then the last line there. So obviously, again, the scheme, the operator will have clients, and they would be involved in the individual agreements between the PSO, the operator, and the participants, the clearing parties that would link into their systems. We would be more involved with rules, multilateral agreements, sponsor bank agreements. In other words, how the regulatory regime applies with regards to who can connect to directly to a operator and who can't. So you could see that the PIB rule setting process would look very different to what PASA currently does. And again, there will have to be a slow separation and evolution of what we call interoperability rules and scheme rules over time. It's not going to be immediate, but this kind of distinction needs to be made in time. Right, now I think we can go a little bit into some of the detail then of the functions, those columns that those 5 columns that we've defined. So let's move to the next slide then. So with regards to rule setting, I think I've already said a lot, but what we then say is the PIB is going to write and manage interoperability rules, and it will do that in consultation of all impacted parties. Although the rules might be written by the people primarily involved with clearing, it will be consulted broader. Settlement rules, we've spoken about it, obviously moves to the SARB. Scheme rules are then managed by the scheme, by the operator, but there could be interoperability rules that could override scheme rules. Dispute resolution related to rules will not sit with the PIB, it will sit with the rule maker. So if it's the PIB or related to an interoperability rule, it comes to the PIB. If it's related to a scheme rule, it goes to the scheme or the operator. So that's basically a high-level summary of the rule setting function and how that would look going forward. Then we go to standard setting. We have to understand there's a lot of standard setting happening in the payment space. We work on certain standards like ISO 20022, and these things, messages and so on, are being defined. And there's always, especially with a richer formats and ISO 20022, there's always room to kind of interpret a message or define a message in a particular way. So let's talk about then technical standard setting around the payments initiation layer. There, the PIB could drive a collaborative process to define standards. Those standards would, in what we've agreed, would be mostly for voluntary adoption. But if the community comes together and say we want to mandate the adoption of this, then it can become a mandatory adoption of a particular standard. The SARB obviously themselves could also mandate certain standards to be adopted. I think QR could be a good example of that. Think about the definition of a QR standard for South Africa. That's typical of what we're speaking about here. If we talk about clearing messages or message standard setting related to clearing, the clearing operators would define clearing standards. The PIB basically just maintains that standards authority to make sure that when a new operator comes in and wants to do a similar thing, we say, well, the standards that has been defined to use are these, and you should also use similar standards. If we get to customer authentication again, the operator again would determine standards related to any authentication element. And we must remember authentication could be an abstracted service that sits above more than one payment system, especially if you think about where we're going with things like digital identity and such. Right, risk management. Now, this is something where the PIB would have to take up a strong role. So risk management, in other words, the monitoring of payment system risk, the highlighting and making it visible if there's a problem. The PIB would assist with a NPS risk identification and monitoring function, so that we get a global view on what kind of risks exists where in the national payment system. And we'll make it visible for everybody to interact with, to engage with, and for us then to mitigate those risks. But the risk element is a big part of the PIB. If we then think about the risk remediation or the risk mitigation actions that would follow, with the PIB forums, so you'll see later that there will be structures for this risk management function. They would identify and make sure that the risk is managed in the right way. It might be that it's handed to a PSO then to deal with, or if it's collective, let's say all the clearing participants, that they deal with it. And they would track the remediation of those risks. It's not to say the remediation itself will actually happen in the PIB, but we will monitor and track the remediation actions. Let's move on to the next slide then, Manal. Then with regards to compliance, so the PIB will build a compliance monitoring action. We will look at compliance data. There will be compliance tracking mechanisms, and we will know who needs to comply, who has complied, who has not complied. The next aspect of compliance then is the enforcement and the sanctioning. So what we say there is the PIB will undertake enforcement actions. So in other words, to say we're picking up a problem that there's non-compliance to a particular aspect, and we will make it visible and ensure that the enforcement happens. But the sanctioning we will not do. We will refer the SARP to the SARP for any sanctioning. So that's, I think, also a slight difference in separation of enforcement and sanctioning compared to how it currently works. Then lastly, administrative support. And again, bearing in mind, this first column is all about payment system management. There's a lot of stuff going on, if I can put it that way. And there's a strong administrative role to play. So let's quickly look at those 3 lines that you see there. Administrative support related to member administration. The PIB will register, administer its members. Administrative support related to secretarial functions or committee functions, committee secretarial functions. The PIB will provide those secretarial functions, make sure that there's a very good record of decisions, proceedings and matters arising and so on. And then administrative support related to the coordination or the management in participant groups. In other words, who needs to be where and so on, distribution lists, all of those things. And then the PIB would support member structures through activities as taking notes, minutes, finalizing an agenda, organizing the meetings, project management if necessary, smaller project management capabilities, uh, communications, and in any other organizational skills that the collective might need. That kind of then relates to that first column, which is payment system management. Right. Everybody happy with that? No hands. Let's move to the second one. So the second one, we've said Manal, you've skipped back. Let's just skip to the next slide. There we go. We said that a lot of things actually continue to evolve to the operator, and it actually becomes a strong operator-centric model as well with regards to certain elements. So first of all, technology and infrastructure. Clear then that the PIB does not provide technology or infrastructure. There's no servers, there's no tech sitting anywhere that needs to be watched and checked on a 24-hour basis, 365 days a year and so on. That all sits with the operators. Product management and clearing services. The PIB then does not provide the actual product management. That is defined in the scheme. And it includes things like if this product is called something like DebiCheck, or let's say with a new rapid payment system, we've got a brand name. Everything related to that product and how the brand needs to be dealt with, handled, and so on, will sit with the scheme or with the operator. Operations, performance, and health monitoring. The PIB is responsible for setting KPIs and monitoring PSO performance and overseeing remediation where required. Moving on then to the next broader section, operational support. So crisis and incident management. The PIB defines frameworks, crisis and incident management frameworks, but the actual management of the crisis is done at the operator level. Operational support, so business continuity management. This is a limited PIB role unless delegated by the SARB or identified in a risk framework that there needs to be a business continuity matter that the PIB itself will pick up. So I think what you could almost write as three important words over all of this here is the PIB role is about risk views, risk perspectives. It's about oversight and monitoring, and it's about frameworks that could define how things happen. But a lot of this then happens with the operator, and it's very much the responsibility of the operator. Right. I think we can move then, Manal, to the third column here. There's a lot in here, so I'm going to go through this very fast. The first gray part that you see there is actually a spelling mistake from our side. It's capacity development, not industry support. So there's a few elements in here. When it gets to professional certifications in line with the NQF, the way the NQF works is that the payment training provider and the qualifications authority can't be the same entity. So there will be a separation. If there's any need for us to start to come up with a professional qualification around payments and so on, it will have to be a separate body. When it gets then to consumer and education awareness, that's also an element that the PIB would not do. The consumer and education is very much related to the product that's being created. And it's the responsibility of the scheme owner then to ensure that there's appropriate uh, consumer education and user education even for the schemes or the products that they actually run. The PIB may have some oversight over that and may request that better education is done or further education is done in certain instances, but it sits with the scheme. Okay, now we're getting to things that the PIB itself will do themselves. So they would very much run conference, seminars, events related to payments. We see that across the world. That's a very strong function. I think one of the best ones that you see is NACHA, that runs an annual conference where over 2,000 people actually attend that conference. It's one of the big events in the USA. And then obviously training or any internship or any leadership development program that might even be run to support um, the payments professional of the future that prepares a person for a career in payments. That will be run by the PIB. Moving to strategy development. Payment strategy would be something that the PIB would be involved in. So they would use policy guidelines like Vision 2025 as a basis, but probably then get involved on the next layer to interpret it and to define that next level of strategy. So how would that then happen in the form of a particular roadmap, or how would certain things, how would certain initiatives align to support policy? We would define that kind of high-level strategy. Moving then to an aspect of strategy, but we've separated that, and that is thought leadership. In other words, to stimulate us as an industry about where the world is going. The PIB would be involved in those functions and would research those, would analyze the market, would benchmark certain things, would have views on best practices elsewhere in the world, and then moving to the next line that you see there under thought leadership, and would often then highlight this or write it up in the form of a white paper, which we will publish to say, this is where the world is moving, let's say, for instance, with CBDC, or this is where the world is moving with open banking and that kind of thing. Payment statistics. Now, the collation, firstly, of payment statistics, much more than what PASA currently does. The PIB would get involved in the collection, consolidation, and interpretation of payment system related statistics. Obviously, it's on a more aggregate level, where we will make it visible, but that kind of role will have to be enhanced from what PASA currently does. And then to obviously also add value to the statistics, derive management information or even strategic insights from that, and to also publish those statistics, which is the last line that you see here. That is a role also that the PIB would be very involved in, and it would report it from time to time to the broader community. Right, if we can then move on. Then the role of industry facilitation. There are certain functions or certain things that the industry would want to come to somebody, in this case now the PIB, for support and help. Now, the first thing is the interpretation of policy and how certain policy needs to be implemented. Let's say we've got a new coffee bill, or FAT F3 or something like that. We will have to be able to help people to interpret payments related policy, and to clarify certain things for them, and to help them to adopt the policies appropriately. And then often we also get into situations where people are asking us to assist with queries, and that's often related to how they actually conduct themselves in payments. That kind of broad-based query management is also something that the PIB would fulfill. I think that then takes care, Manel, of the third column. So let's move to the second last column towards the right hand side of that first picture. Project delivery. Yes, the PIB will run certain projects where required. And then innovations. It might be that the PIB provides also a platform for us to discuss innovation. So if we want to run a sandbox or something, a particular innovation, the PIB could be the platform where that could happen, where we could run something like that. Then the last column, I think. This is the fifth column. Now, if you can just move on, there we go. So industry representation. So industry representation, consultative services, input to regulators, engagement with other policy bodies like the FSCA, advocacy for the industry, broader positions of the industry. What we say is the role of the PIB is to consolidate the industry's view for the regulators and to provide expert advice when required. And then the last one, the industry representation in the form of stakeholder and management collaboration. It's important then to just confirm the PIB will always actively promote collaboration amongst industry stakeholders. I think what is not explicitly stated here, but perhaps needs to be amplified, is the PIB will not be a lobby environment, to lobby particular industries' views. Let's say, for instance, let's say the insurance industry wants to have a particular payment functionality. When it gets to the industry as a whole, yes, then we will do that, but it's not a lobby environment. I see there's a hand here. Let's quickly move to the person with a hand.
That's Johan.
Johan.
Hi, Marit. Thanks. Just a question on, and you just referred to the insurance industry, but just on the role the PIB consolidate industry view for input and regulators. And maybe at this stage, the PIB team might have a different view on this than the NPSD team, but would there be a scenario, or would it be possible maybe in certain instances that even members of the PIB might want to put a different view forward, or their own view forward, in terms of providing feedback to, let's say, regulation changes or anything else? Thanks.
Yes, Johan, I think it will be possible, but it will always then kind of be as a global industry view that we're putting forward with, let's say, separate minority views being listed or clearly identified as this is a different view, but it comes from this industry grouping, and that's their perspective on the matter.
But that would be via the PIB. It would not be allowed on its own directly to the respective regulator.
I can't see a scenario, Johan, where the regulators don't entertain direct engagement on topics from parties. Obviously, everyone would prefer that it get managed within a PIB environment to give a coherent or a comprehensive view of where everybody stands, but I cannot see that would ever preclude direct engagements.
Yeah.
Okay. Exactly. I think that is in line with my thinking. Thanks.
Absolutely. Right. Are you happy, Johan?
Yes. Thanks, Marit.
Okay. Right. If there's no further hands, I think we've dealt with functions now. Now let's look at scope. Scope is then, in what kind of activities will the PIB play those kinds of, fulfill those functions? And I think if we can move to the first slide, I think it's important here to just emphasize that scope is a bit of a dynamic environment. So we see the scope as we currently see it, but it can evolve. It could change. So the scope items that I present here is pretty much a representation of the current topics, and how we see it at this point in time. We have to adopt the openness about scope items that could come in or move out of the PIB. So I don't think this is a definitive final view. It's a point in time view that I'm presenting here. But I think we've debated this quite a lot. It's definitely, I think, a starting point for us, and therefore let's look at the scope items then from that perspective. So let's move to the next slide, Manal. Well, the first thing then to emphasize, and you've heard it a few times today already, is that settlement would sit in the SARP. That's not within the scope of what the PIB will deal with. Now, together with settlement, there's a bit of an uncertainty about everything listed from number 7 to 12 that's related to high value and SAMOS. So it could be impacted. We don't see, for the moment, we park it on the PIB side because we see it as payment systems and payment system management. But because of its close resemblance to SAMOS, we have to adopt an open mind about those payments systems. What is more clear is that now everything from 1 to 6 would sit at the PIB side. That would be obviously your low value electronic funds transfer systems, your typical batch systems, ATMs, everything related to card, including Amex, Diners, fleet cards, your collections environment, including authenticated collections, in other words, your early window collections, real-time clearing, and then the new real-time clearing system that we're building in the form of RPP, which will probably then go in the market under a certain brand name. So that kind of is a starting point for us to think about scope of what the PIB would do. Then I think a number of other things can be added to this perspective. Let's quickly move to the next slide then, Manal. So this gives us a global picture of the various scope elements that we've considered. So we thought about things like APIs, cash, CBDC, what would be our responsibility with regards to common monetary area work, SADC, crypto assets, cross-border. I'm not going to repeat everything on this slide. Let's rather then go into the detail and we will see these things again. And now let's define what would be the scope of the PIB. So let's move on, Manal. So let's talk about APIs. That's the first scope item. I think we're saying that it's a voluntary payment related API standard definition, which means the industry could use the PIB as a platform to define common API standards and specifications. Adoption of that, however, will be market driven. But API and API standard definitions could fall within the scope of what we do. There was, if you move to the next line, which is cash, there was long debates about cash. So sorry, back to the previous slide, Manal. Just the next line. There was long debates about cash, and we must understand there's a huge logistical element to cash. And we made it clear the PIB is not going to be involved in any of the physical logistics of cash or the cash management process related to the logistical cash management process. It will, however, be responsible for where cash and digital start to touch and where there's interoperability elements specifically. For instance, remittances at retail stores, if there's an interoperability issue, cash settlement, cash in and cash out transactions, and any of the cash strategic work that would interface or require some interfaces with the digital work. So when it's about cash to digital interoperability, there the PIB would be involved. Right, I hope that makes the cash picture clear to everybody. Then you think about new things like CBDC. So we will invest resources to build expertise, and we will have to understand this space. Obviously, it's a new space. We don't know what the regulators will ask us to do in future with regards to CBDC, what could unfold in this space. But for now, we just say we need to build capacity to understand CBDC, and when it comes to the day where we need to support it further, we'll have to be able to do that. Closed loop systems and closed loop system interoperability, we've agreed to exclude that. So that's why you see that red cross out of that part. Moving then to common monetary area support, we would be involved in implementation if requested. But we must understand that would be on the request for the PIB to get involved with a CMA type matter. SADC payments, again, it's a matter of understanding, what would be the regional realities, what would be required to unfold on a regional level. We are seeing many examples in the rest of the world where payment system starts to connect on a regional basis. The PIB might get involved, and therefore will have to understand what's the realities of the SADC region. Crypto assets, including all those private issued cryptocurrencies, stable coins, and so on. Again, I think it's more a matter of understanding and monitoring, and to stay close to it so that we can understand how these things could locally impact and what local developments could follow on this topic. Cross-border standards, alignment of domestic standards. The PIB would advocate for international standards, and make sure that that kind of global interoperability capability or potential is preserved in what we are doing. So we'll keep a close eye on what is necessary for cross-border payments, cross-border standards and such, and make sure that it aligns with domestic standards. Right, I think that is everything on this page. Manal, if we can move to the next page, which is the last page. Interchange, we have to understand interchange is always the domain of the SARB. They would set interchange. We have to develop an understanding of what impacts on interchange and how interchange can impact on payment systems and payment system adoption and so on. So we will always provide expert input or expert advice, and we will have to make sure that we're in a position to do that. But we definitely don't set the interchange. That is the SARB's role. The reduction of cash. Obviously, a lot of the digital systems that we implement has cash displacement, cash replacement in mind. The PIB would advocate for digital to always become more and more ubiquitous. But over and above what we do in our payment systems, we are not going to take the lead to promote any initiative aimed at reduction of cash usage. And here we're talking about things like demonetization or any of those kinds of things, that would sit outside what we do. Open payments. Again, the PIB would undertake initiatives to consult members. We would provide inputs to regulatory bodies. If our members want to develop collective perspectives on open banking, the PIB could facilitate those kinds of processes. Overlay services, we're talking about those abstracted services that could potentially serve more than one payment system, like for instance a proxy or an alias capability. The PIB would play a role to harmonize adjacent usage of those services, especially when it's provided by more than one PSO. I think that very strongly relates then to what we discussed under the rules and the interoperability element that you see in the functions. Cross-border regulation, we would at most be an advocate for fit-for-purpose cross-border payments regulation, but over and above that, nothing more. So that could be how international funds transfer, FATF16, all of those things kind of find themselves into some of our payments regulations. So we will play that kind of advocacy role. I think that deals with the scope items. Gita, anything else that you would like to add?
There are a couple of questions, Moritz. The first one is on closed loop, which is crossed out, and just explaining that got incorporated elsewhere. So I don't know if you want to deal with that piece or if you want me to.
You can deal with it. Greatest pleasure, Gita.
So the initial thinking was that there was a role around closed loop systems for the PIB, particularly in standards. So providing standards and explaining the roadmap for when closed loop systems want to become open. The decision about when closed loop systems should become open really is best with the SARB rather than the PIB. The reason it's crossed out is that most of that kind of expert information got moved under query management. So if you want to know the standard for building an XYZ type of system, that would be a query, as would be the roadmap towards opening up. So it's just got moved from a functional point of view rather than being a standalone item. But if support is requested, it would be provided. And then Moritz, the second question is, PASA has been quite vocal about the localization of payment services and keeping all the elements of the payment flow local. Will that be the same with the PIB, or would we look at opening up certain functions to parties outside of South Africa? And ICPA has responded, saying that the NPS Act limits the scope to domestic transactions. The localization of payment systems, and I don't know if that refers to domestic clearing or something like that, is much more a SARB imperative than it is a PASA one. Okay, I assume, Esty, that this is more of a card question about large players who try to operate in South Africa. It depends in what capacity. So I think that's quite a technical conversation. And Pierre, maybe you want to comment, but I'm not aware of anything in the current changes to the Act that would change this.
No, Gita, you're quite right. I'm not aware of any consequential changes to the NPS Act that would change the position. I think with fintechs and the technological environment developing across borders as opposed to domestically, we will have to face that somehow. And I think the SARP is doing it, looking into that with domestic processing, for instance, and some other aspects to it. Is this so not clear exactly yet how we're going to address it, because the internet has just opened up everything and it's difficult to regulate outside of your own borders.
I'm also reading ST's question, ST, and you can jump in here, but we must remember, you're talking about entrance, international entrance. Licensing will be the domain of the SARP. So if somebody wants to come and run, let's say a new payment scheme here, that license would be dependent on the SARP. I mean, obviously on the recommendations of us, that such a new player could be or should be allowed, and for what it could do to competition and interoperability and so on. But it's very possible then that this entity first will have to be licensed by the SARP, and that changes, I think, the world. We must also understand the current regulatory or the current positions on international usage of or international transactions. Let's say, for instance, card transactions happening overseas or being
maybe sorry, just to jump. I just want to clarify my question a little bit. Sorry, I know it was a very broad question. So it was that as well, but also broadly in terms of large players coming into South Africa and then wanting to outsource certain functions, such as transactions, authorizations, etc., outside the borders of South Africa. And although settlement processes, because keeping in mind they've got global footprints, and I was just wondering whether or not that would be in scope for kind of looking into that, where they're trying, because they are globally entering into, they're global players and they're coming into South Africa wanting to streamline their systems. So I was just wondering if that was something that you were looking at. If not, then that's also an answer, but I just kind of wanted to get an answer to that.
Well, I think the answer there is that the regulator themselves have basically firm views on what can and can't and so on. Obviously, we might advise them in that, but it's very much a regulatory view.
Yeah, and the commercial implications as well, depending on which payment stream you're in. Esther, I think we should unpack that one separately, though, because it is a very broad question, quite a lot of technical detail. So if you'd like an offline discussion, just let us know, please.
Okay, I think we've dealt with most of the questions, Gita, and I think in the interest of time, we need to move on. So I'm handing over to you now, and I just want to say to everybody, bear with this. This is the most important part, I think, just to give a marketing spiel for Gita. And thereafter, we will anyway also have another comfort break. So let's get into this part, because this is also very important.
Thanks, Maritz. And nice to be chatting to you all again after an hour or so. Okay, mandate and recognition, I'm going to run through very fast because I think we've already touched on the core components of it. I just want to show you the pieces of how it, of kind of how it emerges. So this is more of the story. Thanks, Manal. So you would have seen in the design principles, there's this balance between policy objectives and the good of the NPS and member interests. And that in mandate translates into regulatory recognition around country objectives and member mandate given by your members for member interests. And there are certain functions, which we've now covered, that fall within each. So, for example, for regulatory you need regulatory recognition in order to be able to do rule setting, compliance management, enforcement of standards, making sure that risk standards and performance standards are upheld. And as I mentioned earlier, probably the most critical one is South African specifics in comparison to international scheme rules, local nuances on specific transaction types around when we implement interoperable functionality, etc. So in order to do those, and in order for the PIB to be able to enforce interoperability, you need some level of regulatory recognition. By the same token, on the next slide, Manal, and these are examples, it's not a comprehensive list of all of the functions that we, mapped against each mandate type. In order to do training, run conferences, talk on behalf of the industry around industry facilitation, produce payment statistics, do joint strategy development, you have to have a member mandate. That can't be given to you by the regulator. So if you jump to the next slide, we reached the conclusion, which is very much in keeping with the design principles, that there's need for both regulatory recognition for the PIB, and obviously it has a need for a member mandate as well. Thanks, Manal. So we took a decision to the PIB saying, what kind of regulatory recognition does the PIB need? So this was a community decision that was taken as part of our workshops. We didn't need to do the same for member mandate because member mandate is implicit in the structure. So through the creation of an AGM, incorporation documents that give it its powers, responsibilities, etc., all of that would give the member mandate. So the regulatory mandate, that decision that was taken with massive support, I think it was near 100% from the community, was that the PIB needed some recognition in law, which must include all licensed entities being members, but must go a step further. And somehow, whether it was a directive or the equivalent under the changes to the Act, it must have some firm regulatory recognition in law. So once this decision was taken by the community, we wrote to the Reserve Bank saying this is the decision from the community. And the Reserve Bank came back to us on the next slide, Manal. And Tim actually came and asked the community about whether this proposal would meet the requirements of our request or not. And there was very strong support that it does. And the proposal that he put forward is what we've discussed. It's the two-pillar approach, where all licensed entities have to be members in good standing of a PIB, and where the PIB itself will be licensed to perform key functions, which include rules that supersede scheme and operator rules and managing risk, etc. So that is the story about how we got to the point that we did. It was in response to a request that was from the community, which was interpreted by the Reserve Bank, and they came back to us with this proposal. As we discussed in the introductory section, this is very foundational to the working of the PIB. Thanks, Manal. Okay, membership and governance. So this piece is interesting in that there are some bits that are still not totally finalized. We have very clearly identified where those are, although I really don't want to go into the specifics of the debate. In some instances where debates appear to largely have been resolved, we are giving you a sneak taste or preview of what we will be positioning for final sign-off. So there is some content here that has not necessarily been through the full process. And again, we will very clearly highlight when we deal with that. This is a deck that's very difficult to summarize in a few slides. So what we've got today is very much in line with what was initially presented to the community. I am, however, going to run through it very quickly and focus on key concept and principle slides rather than plumbing all of the detail. So if there's something I skip over where you'd like more detail, please shout. And if you have questions in looking at some of the content afterwards, please, you know where to find us. So just to explain the approach that we're going to be taking here. Thanks, Manal. The one thing I would like to say maybe before I even get into the detail is you will have noticed that there is a very strong build-up of content that rests on each other. So you start off with the foundational principles, you then get into function and scope. Function and scope drive the need for a certain mandate. Function and scope and the mandate and the regulatory recognition then drive certain ways of working that play through within the membership and governance pieces. And then, of course, those structures drive elements that will play out in the funding conversation. So it's very difficult to pull these apart, and there is a very strong golden thread that flows through the build-up of the design. Because some of this is material that is a bit new, we've used the same legends that we have always used when we've shown changes to socialized material. So if content has been removed, it's struck out in red. If content has been added, it's in blue. The moment it goes from blue to normal color is the point at which everybody has seen it and signed off on it. Black tick is still a recommendation. New slides means this is new content which will be formally positioned at the end of the month. And a cross through a slide means that for some reason that slide's been removed entirely. So there is still, as I said, some not completely concluded stuff in this piece. Thanks, Manal. Okay, next slide, please. So as with everything else, this was very heavily driven by the design principles, but there are some elements which kind of crystallized beyond the design principles that we thought were important to consider in doing the membership and governance piece. So this slide is a combination of design principles, but also some pragmatic elements, like you probably want fewer membership categories to reduce administrative complexity and overhead if you can. But most of this is really rewording or straight copying, in fact, of the design principles. So bringing in the non-licensed entities, separating licensed members and how they're treated from unlicensed members, controls to balance decision-making, the concept of skin in the game, or a seat at the table, etc. So this should be very familiar in the context of the previous conversations. Probably the one piece that's a little bit different is this payment licensing requirements define the membership category. So if you have multiple licenses, then you would fall in the membership category of the most onerous license that you hold. So let me explain that one. If you have a license in activity-based licensing to provide settlement services, to provide clearing services, to provide to act as a system operator and to act as a TPPP. So you're licensed for a whole lot of things. Settlement doesn't fall within the PIB, so the most onerous of those is probably the clearing participant or clearing service provider license, and therefore you would fall into that category when we talk into membership categories, even though you might be licensed to provide services in other categories. Thanks, Manal. Okay, and the way we tackle this conversation is we first look at the different types of members. We then from there go into member committees and structures. And I'd like to point out that this is where the real decision making and work takes place. So these are actually quite important. Then there's the board, which we've discussed to some extent as the ultimate governing body. We then pull it all together into a single slide that shows you the picture. And then Cosmo later will tackle the funding piece of work. Thanks, Manal. Okay, membership, next one. Okay, so this slide is here more for your interest. And what it does is it lists all of the type of payment activities that the very initial version of the regulatory amendments suggest would be licensed. This is subject to change. It's a very early draft, but it's here to give you a sense of whether you're going to fall in the licensing net or not. And you can see that it is very broad. It covers today's TPPs and SOs. It also covers things like domestic remittances, even though you've got a bank behind you in order to support that. So it is very, very broad, and a whole lot more people will be licensed than is the case today. Thanks, Manal. Can go on to the next slide. Okay, so this is the heart of it. These are the entities organized by their activities. So you see, we talk to them according to the activity on the column on the far most left that would make up the members of the PIB. So the first is systemically important clearing participants. And we separated these from other clearing participants because systemically important clearing participants are parties who are big enough that if something were to go wrong with them, it brings the whole system to risk, puts the whole system at risk. The Reserve Bank today identifies 6 banks as systemically important from a prudential perspective. The concept of systemically important from a payments perspective is not there yet, although we understand that it probably will come. In the meantime, the proposal is that those 6 systemically important prudential banks who do the majority of the payment volumes would fall into this category, and the rest would fall into category 3. Category 3, though, which is the other clearing participants, also includes non-banks designated to provide clearing services. Then we've got the clearing operators in line 2. So those are the banks of Visa, MasterCard, and Straight, who are currently authorized by PASA. Then we've created a catch-all category in row 4, which we've just called PSPs for want of a better term. Those are anybody who is licensed to provide payment services and doesn't fall into the 3 rows above. So there aren't participants in clearing and there aren't clearing operators. It's everybody else. So the TPPs, the SO, the domestic remitters, all of those people. And finally, the non-licensed entities in row 5 that we've called the other interested or impacted parties, which very quickly got reduced to the horrible acronym OIIP, because that is a tongue twister of note. And we'll talk to that in a bit more detail later, but that is everybody who has an interest in payments. It's users of payment systems whose businesses wouldn't exist without payment systems acting efficiently. It's people who provide services to payment system providers, so software writers, consultants, expert legal advisors. It's everybody who feels they have a stake in the broader payments community. And you'll remember when we started the PIB process, we actually went out on social media and asked everybody who thought that they had a stake in this to put up their hands. And a very broad range of people do have an interest and are included in this design process. Thanks, Manal. Can go on to the next slide. So other interested and impacted parties also includes trade associations. So, for example, the Banking Association of South Africa, the PSSF, the MFSA, CIBA, E-Commerce Forum SA, all of the associations would fall into this category as well. And all of these are obviously voluntary membership. And we've proposed 2 types of membership for these voluntary members. The one is basic, where you just have access to information. And the second is a prime membership, where you choose payment streams that you want to be consulted on. And you pay extra in order to be consulted on those payment streams that are relevant to you. You will note that this slide is not signed off. There are a couple of open topics on it, but this was the proposal that was put forward. Thanks, Manal. The role of association slide is also not signed off. There's been a lot of debate around associations because some associations have members who have to be licensed, some associations have members who will be voluntary, some associations have members that fall into both, and then there's even cases where we have associations of associations. We are proposing as inclusive approach as possible, and to say whoever wants to be part of this should be able to be part of it, obviously within the parameters that are defined as we go through the rest of this. So, for example, if Banking Association wanted to be a member in its own right, it could do so. But obviously all of its members who participate in payments, which is not all its members, in fact, would need to be members in their own right. And similar for other organizations like CIBA and ASO. We've said to the associations, you may choose not to be members because all your members are there, but if they wanted you to represent you in a given stakeholder forum, you would be there in their voice anyway. So what we're proposing is a very broad, you decide what works for you and your association, and we'll accommodate. This, as I say, is also still up for debate. Next slide. Okay, membership categories. Thanks, Manal. So given the previous slide, we said, so given these kind of 5 or 6 different parties, how do we organize them by category? And as you can see on this slide, there were 7 different options put forward. The process we followed was to actually do all the detail around what each category does, its rights and obligations, where it participates, and then to group them according to who has exactly the same. And that landed us in a place where all the clearing participants make up one group, whether they're SI or not SI. Then all of the clearing operators make up another group. Then the PSPs, then the other interested or impacted parties. So the model that has been signed off, and this model has been signed off, is option 6, that talks to 4 member categories made up of clearing participants, clearing operators, payment service providers, and then the voluntary category. As I say, there's still some debate around the timing, etc., of the voluntary category, but the principle of the 4 categories has explicitly been signed off. Thank you. And you will see we use those 4 categories now through everything that follows, except in the board structure, where we have split out the SI clearing from the non-SI, just because of the risk elements and the skin in the game component. Okay. Then let's talk to the committee types. Thanks, Manal. We can go on to the next slide. So we have separated them into different categories. The first is the governance structures, with the board as the ultimate governing body, which we've spoken about. The board, of course, as is practice, and in fact is a requirement under Companies Act, now that this is going to be a company, is required to set up certain board committees. I think there's one that's mandatory, the rest are optional, but the point is the board can set up board committees, which are in effect an extension of the board, but specialist expertise to help the board fulfill its duties. Then we've allowed for stakeholder forums at a board level. So if the board feels for whatever reason some group of stakeholders is not adequately included in the member participation structures, or they need to engage with parties outside of the participation structures and at a board level, then they may do so. The current proposal on the table does give extensive involvement to all parties, so whether those are necessary or not remains to be seen in the transition planning. Advisory committees are expert committees like legal committees, competition committees, risk committees, cyber crime committees, who are made up of subject matter experts and provide expertise, knowledge, and support to the member participation structures and indeed any other forums that may need it. The member participation structures are where the stuff actually happens. That's where the industry gets together and decides on how we're going to do projects, how we're going to manage rules, how do we manage risk, etc., etc. And then finally, as grey, is the PIB itself will have its own management structure. It must have an executive committee with authority delegated from the board in order to actually do the day-to-day running of this entity. That is not covered in the membership and governance piece. It's a piece, the structure of the PIB itself will have to be mapped out in the transition planning, but because that is a operational administrative function, it therefore is not a key component of the design of how the PIB will work. So what we are doing in this next section is focusing on the various member participation structures and how they are going to work and who has what involvement in them. It does come with a bit of a disclaimer in that we've identified member participation structures and said all of these must exist, but whether each of these will be an actual committee or whether things could be joined together or how they split across the various payment streams is work that will be done in the transition planning. So we've agreed on the kind of categories of work that needs to be done in structures, but the actual structures and whether, for example, a consultation structure is a mailing list with a shared database of information and documents remains to be seen. Thanks, Manal. Okay, so the member participation structures. Those of you who attended the various plenaries on this will remember we looked at it from a member involvement point of view before a structure point of view. Today we've turned it upside down just for entertainment, and we're going to look at the structures first. Thanks, Manal. Okay, this slide is also very important. And this is how the delegation of the decision making would work in the PIB. So the board, as we've said, is the apex governance body. It delegates responsibility to a structure. And that would be a structure terms of reference or a constitution or some document that defines how that member structure works, who are members of it, its areas of responsibility, how it votes, all the rest of it. The structure then fulfills its delegated responsibility, building obviously the levels of support from the various participants in the structures. Depending on what they're working on, they may need to go to a stakeholder forum. They may need to also go to an expert forum for legal or competition advice. They may need to go to a regulator for a no objection, as we often see in the debit order space. So if there's a need to confirm that what is being done doesn't have conduct issues. And depending on what the decision is, it may need to go for board approval, although the board obviously would look at the governance process followed, not the technical content. The big thing about this, though, is the middle one, which is the stakeholder forum consultation. So if there are parties who are not a member of the structure, so you're either interested in impacted parties, you don't sit on the rule structure for interoperability rules, but the changes to the rules could have material impact on your business, there is a need for the stakeholder forum consultation. And the expectation is the board will say, was this consultation done? Was it done fairly? Was the feedback taken into account? And if not, then board approval would be a problem. So the consultation piece is very important, as is the delegation of authority and the flow through the various parties who would be involved in decision making. There is a piece there explaining who would be consulted. And all of this, as you would have heard earlier, is completely in line with the design principles. Thanks, Manal. Okay. The other thing we did, and I'm not going to spend time on this, is in looking at the various structures, we literally mapped all of the functions against which structure will fulfill them. And maybe what I will do at this point is just explain the structures. So we talk about Stratco structures, which take an overarching overview of all of the elements that are taking place in a given payment stream. So whether it's strategic, whether it's regulatory, whether it's risk-based, we're proposing that there is a single overarching structure that has a view of all of it. And we're proposing tentatively that it is split into 4 different areas. So low-value debits, so the whole collections world, low-value credits, which would be the payments world, card, and then potentially a high-value credits environment. But you can see there are ways we could chop and change that slightly differently. Then there are the rule-making and regulatory structures, which do the rule setting, the standard setting, monitoring compliance. Then there's a risk and oversight and operational effectiveness structures. Those would be the guys who look at risk. They would look at crisis and incident frameworks, the KPIs and KRAs that Moritz spoke about earlier in terms of operator performance. The strategy structures are probably going to be rolled into the Stratco structures. Then project structures. So if you're running a specific project, it'll need a dedicated structure. And then the consultation structure, which is the environment in which you will consult with all the parties who are impacted by a given change. And as I said, whether that's a physical meeting, whether it's a mailing list, whether it's some other technology solution, we don't know yet. We also acknowledge that there are some functions that don't fall within a member structure. And just for completeness, we share those. So industry representation and facilitation probably falls across all the structures, depending on the topic. So you'd probably set up a dedicated meeting or forum or structure to look at feedback on, for example, open banking. And then there are functions which are management responsibility, and those would be things like administrative support, training, although there is a number of people have pointed out to us that there should be wider involvement in the community in the capacity building work. Research, payment statistics are functions that would have to be done by management and therefore cannot be delegated to a structure or cannot be put within a structure. Okay, thanks, Manal. Within the structures, there are different roles. So you could be a voting participant, you could be consulted, you could be informed, and the difference between consulted and informed is partly around what type of voluntary membership people choose, but also around, is there a need for you to be consulted? So if you're not impacted by a decision at all, then there's no reason for you to be consulted on the decision. Only parties who actually are legitimately impacted should be consulted. And then their expert advisors is more the subject matter experts sitting on an expert forum. The board would create participation structures, delegate the relevant authorities, and it should also be noted that some structures won't involve voting. So advisory committees, so the expert committees and stakeholder forums, which is really an engagement opportunity. Thanks, Manal. Okay, participation in structures. And I'm going to now start running very quickly now that we've covered the key points. Thanks, Manal. Next slide. So the Stratco structures, we've said pretty much anybody can be involved in. Obviously, the voluntary would depend on their membership type. And remember, there's still the big open question around the voluntary piece. The big challenge in the strategy structures is you can't have a cost of thousands sitting in a low value debit Stratco. So we've, according to best practice, proposed that you limit membership to 30. And now you can see why associations will really matter, because you may have constituencies who are represented by a single person on behalf of an association, so that we can keep these forums manageable. Thanks, Manal. Then rulemaking and regulatory structures. So these are the guys who do the interoperability rules. These ones, the only voting parties are those who actually play in the interoperability space, which is clearing at this point. But there is the requirement for consultation with those who are impacted by interoperability rules. There are some complexities in this around how you balance the rights of issuers and acquirers, and that's a very important conversation, but not going to spend time on it at the moment. Our sense is that everybody who participates in clearing in a given stream would have to sit on the interoperability or the rulemaking and regulatory structure, but that you probably need to have a supermajority vote in terms of rules. And we have recommended independent chairs for these. For the payment initiation piece, but for the actual rules, we've recommended member appointed. Thank you, Manal. As I said, the voting participants are only if you are actually playing in the space. So the clearing participants, the clearing operators, impacted parties are consulted. The only place it's different is if you're talking about standards for payment initiation layers. And then compliance obviously has to be by the PIB itself and independent. It wouldn't be done by a member structure. Thanks, Manal. Okay, operational risk and operational effectiveness. Again, this is the people who participate in the space. So those who actually are involved in clearing. This we have proposed is chaired by independent SMEs, which would probably be PIB personnel. And this would deal with things like the risk frameworks, the KPIs we spoke about before, the incident management frameworks, etc., etc. Thanks, Manal. We can jump to the next one. Again, we've talked about supermajority voting here and consultation of impacted parties. Thanks, Manal. Strategy structures, as we've said, are probably part of the stratcos, limit in numbers, although open to everybody. There would, we think, have to be overarching payment strategy environments that look at convergence across streams. So it's not good enough just to look at low value credits and card, because they're both offering separately, because they're both converging on offering real-time payments. So, you know, you have to have somewhere where you look at things like that and QR codes, which are applicable across all real-time payments, whether they're card or EFT based. So we do think that there will need to be specific overarching payment strategy environments. There will probably have to be specific strategy working groups on things like QR codes, proxies, etc., or even dedicated strategy structures on emerging topics. Like the example we keep using is open banking. So there would have to be some flexibility on these, and many of them would be created ad hoc as and when needed, but they would feed into the stratcos who take the overview across the various payment streams. Thanks, Manal. And there we've pretty much opened it up to everybody who is a provider of payment services with consultation with the users of payment services. Thanks, Manal. Project structures are obviously ad hoc and per project, and everybody who's involved in the project needs to be there irrespective of their role. So this is the one place where we see users very heavily involved, as in fact is the case in PASA today when we look at the AC Steerco, for example. So this is not without precedence. And everybody who has to deliver in order to make a interoperability project work would need to have a seat at this table. Thanks, Manal. And you can see that reflected in the fact that everybody who's involved needs to be there. Again, to keep it manageable, some of it will probably have to be via associations. Otherwise, you could land up with costs of thousands, which is unworkable. Thanks, Manal. And then the consultation structures. As I said, this is not necessarily a structural forum, although it might be, but there has to be a means of consulting when, for example, rulemaking and regulatory forums make changes that could impact on parties who are not sitting in the room. And the purpose of these structures or processes would be to make sure that that consultation happens. Obviously, the parties from the decision-making forum would need to be represented there to consult and to engage with the parties who are being consulted. Thanks, Manal. And you can see what happens there is they're the parties who consulted and everybody else is informed. Thanks, Manal. What we then did, and I'm going to flick through this very fast, is we turned it on its side and we said by member category, so the 4 member categories that we spoke about, or in fact the 5, because we hadn't put the clearing participants together at that point, what rights and which structures do each of these parties sit in? We're not going to spend time unpacking this now. In the later session where Moritz is going to talk about a day in the life of, or personas, explaining how specific entities will engage with the PIB, there's a lot more color on it. So this is really just for your interest. Manal, the next slide. I'm just going to explain the layout. So you can see all the structures down the left-hand side. So advisory committees, board stakeholder forums, stratcos, rulemaking, risk and operational, etc. Across the top, you can see the role on that. So voting, consulted, informed, or expert advisor. And this table in particular is for systemically important clearing participants. And you can see that they vote in the majority of the voting forums. There's not many places where they're consulted because they don't need to be, but there are places where they're informed, for example, the consultation structures. Manal, let's skip over the next one, which I think is the operators. Skip over the next one, which is the other clearing participants, which is exactly the same as the systemically important. And now you can see why we put them together as one member category, and go on to the PSP, which is the next slide. Now, the PSPs you see are actually voting participants on quite a broad range of structures. Where they're not a voting participant, they are consulted. And everybody in all of this has the ability to put SMEs into expert environments and to be informed where they are not voting or consulted. Thanks, Manal. Let's look at the next one. So the voluntary members, as I say, still up for discussion. Generally not voting unless it's within a project structure, consulted, and that is obviously a non-negotiable given the way the design principles are structured. Informed, also non-negotiable in terms of the design principles and the ability to provide expert advisors into various environments like advisory committees, but also expert advisors into some of the strategy environments. Thanks, Manal. And then non-members. So there is some information that should be shared with non-members, probably via portals, online portals. And there are cases where you would go out and potentially probably pay somebody to bring expert advice on a topic into an advisory forum, and they don't necessarily need to come from a member. Thanks, Manal. Okay. Other participation structures. So we've dealt with the heart of it, where members do their work. Flick through, please. Okay, the advisory committees we've spoken about, so those are the expert committees. Next slide. Again, anybody can appoint SMEs, or you might actually go and hire from outside. Next slide. Board stakeholder forums would be at board discretion as and when needed. We've discussed those. Thank you. Board composition. Right, so before we go here, just to remind you that board members have a duty to apply their mind with unfettered discretion, complete independence, and with a responsibility to the entity, the NPS, and the members. Thanks, Manal. And of course, the Companies Act very firmly outlines the fiduciary duty, as does King 4. This slide explains the board structures of various other equivalent entities, including PASA. The key points are that the executive directors from the PIB should be board members. And initially, we had proposed that the SARB would also have a non-voting board member. That no longer makes sense in the context where the entity is licensed by the SARB, because that gives the SARB oversight and supervisory responsibility for the PIB, and therefore to sit on the board of an entity where you have that responsibility doesn't make sense. So this is one that is going to have to come back to the plenary, but initially we said that the Reserve Bank should be there. Thanks, Manal. So King 4 recommends that the majority of directors on a board should be non-executive, i.e. not working for the entity, and that the majority of the non-executive should be independent. And this is the one place where we have diverged a little bit from King 4, because the kind of expertise and skin in the game that you need on this board means that you cannot be majority board independent. So to balance that, we have proposed an independent chair and vice chair, and we'll look at the split of independence on the following slides. Thanks, Manal. Board size, we've said got to keep it manageable between 10 and 15. Given the kind of sensitivities around negotiating the structure, we've landed up at 15. Thanks, Manal. Okay, so we've gone through various board composition options. At the last plenary, we recommended option 5, which still had the Reserve Bank in there. We think we are quite close to agreement on option 6, which has 2 executive directors, so 2 PIB employees. And you'll notice we always want the 2 there, not 1, so that they keep each other honest. 4 independent directors, and again, you'll note we've never dropped below that, so it's 4 out of 15. Then 6 from the clearing participants, which means they do not have a majority, and 3 from the PSP and other interested and impacted parties from the rest. We believe this is a balanced board that would have the right balance of skills and expertise and member experience and knowledge of the NPS to be able to function. As I say, the last one we proposed was option 5, which still had the SARB there. We're now proposing option 6, which no longer has the SARB there and gives that additional seat to the SI clearing participants, given their very deep and broad expertise in keeping payment systems safe. But that will formally be consulted with the industry and sent for sign-off at the next workshop. Thanks, Manal. Board committees, we've said that obviously the entity will have to comply with the law, but the board needs to decide what board committees it needs to fulfill its duties. And that's all this slide says. Thank you. The board member appointment process. Okay, we'll start with the easy one, which is the appointment of independent board members. And this is quite important because some of it is a departure from what we have today. Thanks, Manal. Next slide. So the first thing is the board has, or the nomination committee, if there is one, but some board structure has to assess the board. So do we have the right balance of skills, expertise, diversity? And where we don't, what skills, expertise, diversity, independence, whatever do we need? So you first define what the requirements are, you then define a candidate criteria, and then you obtain candidates. Those candidates then have to be assessed, whether by a board or the nominations committee, due diligence, weren't involved in state capture, have the relevant skills, meet the criteria. The board can then appoint on an interim basis until the next general meeting, and at the general meeting, the board recommends the independent directors to the general meeting, and the general meeting approves or declines that recommendation. For those of you who are PASA members, this is pretty much how the PASA process works and is very in line with how independent board members are generally appointed. So this one is kind of stock standard. It gets more interesting when we get to the member elected or appointed board members. So next slide, Manal. We proposed 2 options for member elected board members. I'm not going to go through them both. I'm going to go through this option 1, which is the option that was selected. It is a little bit of a departure from the normal practice, but that is done because of the importance of the member voice in this process. So the starting is exactly the same. You assess what skills, experience, expertise, diversity do you need. So it's not done in a vacuum. You call for nominations of people who meet those criteria. And you call for nominations of individuals. So if we're talking about the 6 SI clearing participants, you go to the 6 SI clearing participants and you say, nominate individuals, Gita Erling, who meets these criteria, who should be a board member. That nomination must be supported by at least 2 nominators, preferably from different organizations. So the person must have at least some level of support that they recognize to have these skills. And the candidate obviously must accept the nomination. The next piece then is the same. So whether it's the board or the nomination committee, they do the due diligence, they assess whether they meet the skills. At this point, it's a pass or fail. So you may stay in the pool of candidates or you may wash out of the pool of candidates. Then all of the nominees who meet the criteria through this due diligence process get put forward to those 6 systemically important clearing participants so that they can vote as to who would be the board members coming from their constituency. Each member would cast a vote per board seat, and obviously the nominees receiving the highest number of votes would be appointed to the board. So a couple of things here. Systemically important clearing participants only vote for the board seats for systemically important clearing participants. There's a separate process that is run for the other clearing participants and a separate process that's run for pretty much everybody else. And the whole point of doing it this way is that you want the right individuals appointed for their skills, their knowledge, their expertise, and their ability to do the right thing for the industry and for the members. Thank you. I'm not going to spend time on option 2, which was a similar process, except that the board selected the members and put them to the new board members and put them to the constituency to vote yes or no. So there was less control for the constituencies. Thank you, Manal. This summary slide says we've gone with option 1 because of the member-based nature of the organization, acknowledging it is a deviation from the normal practices, but thinking that it's a good compromise in giving members a meaningful voice in the board. Thanks, Manal. Board mandate. Thank you. I'm not going to spend time on this. This slide is basically an explanation of the Companies Act, how the general meeting through the memorandum of incorporation gives the board its powers, etc., etc. This is basically theory. Read it in your own time if you're interested. There's one relevant piece, and it's not signed off yet, and that is voting at the AGM. Our proposal has been quite similar to what we do in the PSO design process, where each core or each category has got to have a majority vote, and we're proposing that 3 out of the 4 member categories would have to vote for a resolution to pass, so that no one party can veto. This is still completely up for debate, so that just gives you the context. Please do understand, though, that in terms of the Companies Act, there are certain things like changes to the MOI which require special resolutions, which will require a supermajority like a 75% or an 80% anyway. So irrespective of what we choose in terms of how AGM voting would work, that those rules from the Companies Act would still apply. Thanks, Manal. Okay, next slide is the conceptual structure. So what does it look like when you put it all together? Yeah, so at the top you've got the general meeting, which is the members. The members appoint or elect through the process that we've spoken about the board. The board obviously is the apex governing body, has the fiduciary duties. It's the limit of its powers are determined in terms of the memorandum of incorporation. The board itself determines what board committees it needs, aside from, I think it has to have an audit committee in terms of the Companies Act, but I'm not the expert, and gives the terms of reference to those board committees, which are actually seen as part of the board function. The board further may decide to create stakeholder forums where it wants to engage directly with certain communities of stakeholders. If you look to the left at the first downwards arrow, the board delegates authority to the management of the PIB, so an ExCo and some kind of operating model in order for it to do its work. The board creates all of the member participation structures and gives those terms of reference, or they define constitutions or whatever it is that is signed by the board, and delegates authorities to those environments. That would include the expert committees we've spoken about, which you can see are half member and half not member, because you might bring in non-member experts. and all the member structures. So the overarching stratcos, the various strategy forums, which could be separate to the stratcos if they cut across different payment streams, then the rulemaking and regulatory, risk operational, effectiveness, project and consultation structures. So this slide basically pulls together everything that has been discussed and puts it into one picture. There's quite a lot of devil in the detail as to going and defining each of those forums, and that is part of the work that we would do in the transition planning. Thanks, Manal.
Right, on to our next section, and it's my privilege now to also then introduce Cosmo again to you. Cosmo is our Chief Financial Officer at PASA. She was very involved with this funding work, and who better than to take you through this and to allow you to orientate yourself a little bit with regards to the funding aspect, which I'm sure is very important to all of you because it touches your pockets. Over to you, Cosmo.
Thank you so much, Maurits, and thank you, Gita. In carrying on with the golden thread, I'll be articulating funding and other obligations. If you can move on to the next slide, please. So in summary, I'm going to speak to a brief introduction on funding and other obligations. I'll give an overview of total funding in terms of all the income sources for the PIB. I'll speak to funding, which is split into two parts: funding part A, which is subscription of fees, and funding part B, which is PASA assets. And then I'll close off with a brief discussion of other obligations. Moving on to the next slide, thank you. Very briefly, in terms of, we all need to be cognizant of some uncertainties that unfortunately are there by virtue of the fact that we're trying to create something new, something in the future. So some of these have been mentioned already previously, either by Gita or Maurits, but please be reminded that some key uncertainties which will impact funding itself and other obligations include, for instance, the target operating model and day one functions of the PIB, where while we're very close to understanding what that looks like, there's still some effort and work that needs to be done in order to ensure that we cost it appropriately. The number of licensed PSPs members is also unknown at this point in time, although in the computations that I'll present to you in slides to come, we've taken into account current PASA authorized SOs and registered TTTs and so forth. But there's uncertainty with regards to how many will actually end up signing up when the time comes. The number of other interested and impacted parties is also unknown. And as already mentioned, there's some gray, this is still under deliberation and has not been finalized yet with regards to timing, particularly as to when these voluntary members will join the PIB. But in the computations, we've just included them to, and so the view that you will see would be in a situation whereby from day one, they're members of the PIB. Some legal complexities with regards to PASA's tax exemption still need to be aligned. We're working with our tax advisors and legal experts to just get a final view on this, but obviously it's also a function of some of the decisions and sign-offs that need to be achieved before we can close off on some of those areas. And as mentioned previously, the coffee bill, the impact of the coffee bill on the number of licensed entities will also impact the proposed funding approach. Although each day with each day that passes, we get closer and closer to getting a good view of what that will look like. But then again, the timing, whether the coffee bill will come into place first or whether the PIB will be established first, time will tell. As a result of all these uncertainties, we've agreed to a two-stage funding process. So the first one, we've gone out to market and asked for a sign-off on principle. It's principle-based. At the time that is appropriate, we'll then come back to market to ask for sign-off on the actual numbers in terms of not indicative numbers, but on the actual moderated numbers based on what we'll actually know at that point in time. So the sign-offs for phase one is limited to confirmation that members or potential members are prepared to pay their fair share of the PIB cost and to actually just approve the funding approach based on the principles articulated. Not the, although I've presented indicative numbers, that's just to give a view of what that looks like now. But we will have a second step whereby we will go through the actual numbers themselves. And again, we'll run these in the models expressed and come back to industry to discuss these for sign off. Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next slide. When we look at the national payment system and we look at the critical role that the PIB plays, we think it's very much aligned with it being a shared public good utilities. So here we're looking at the infrastructure that is established, and by infrastructure, I'm looking at structures and facilities and so forth that allow for common payments to be done and to ensure that there is interoperability of payments, and the role that the PIB plays in that. We see this as a shared public goods utility. So here we're looking at, it's similar to roads that are established, buildings, etc. So in looking at it as a shared public goods utility, we've basically looked at estimating or proportionating the cost according to the NPS usage. So the approach taken to pricing is that we've priced for risk. And risk here is represented by transaction volumes and values. We've priced for the benefit derived, which is represented by revenue earned from payments. Again, this is aligned with the volumes and values as an approximation, and the effort expended by the PIB, which is represented by membership rights and obligations. You'll see in the actual formulas that are further presented that in that way we feel we're able to actually then share the cost based on some level of usage in the national payment system. Thank you. The next slide, which speaks to funding guidelines. Thank you. So with regards to the funding guidelines, we followed the funding guidelines, which are very similar to the guidelines, the broad guidelines that we've used in this whole project, which I'll unpack some of the key ones to note. But first and foremost, the board, as mentioned, is the apex of the governance body of the PIB. So the board shall be responsible for approving the annual budget for the PIB. The members will be engaged through the AGM in testing the acceptability of the budget to make sure that they agree with it, they're prepared to fund this budget and so forth. Keep in mind that the budget is driven by business as usual compliance, as well as some other projects that the PIB will be running to support the national payment system. So a two-step process has been followed. An expert working group has been put together to determine the guidelines that I'm unpacking and the formulas and the models and the numbers that I'm going to speak to now, these indicative numbers. But step two, as mentioned earlier, will then come back to re-engage the community once we actually have the PIB budget on day one, which will be put together as part of the transition. The budget will be funded by allocating the costs between the member categories expressed earlier by Gita, which is your direct clearing participants, which includes the SIs and other clearing participants, the system operators, the PSPs, and other interested or impacted parties, with that slight disclaimer on other interested and impacted parties. For now, they're included in all the analysis. Funding from direct clearing participants will be calculated based on the payment system market share or throughput, based on clearing volumes and values. We have to come up with some scientific way of computing this. So volumes and values, particularly for the clearing participants, is the most reliable source of information or data that we can actually use to help in this computation or in this formula or model. Funding from the PSOs will also be calculated based on their market share or total throughput across all their managed payment systems. Again, calculated for clearing volumes and clearing values across their payment systems. With regard to the PSPs, we've had to look at it a bit different from the two categories mentioned earlier, where we calculate based on the number of payment streams that they participate in, moderated for the size of the PSP. So for the size of the PSP, be it small, medium, or large, there's a separate slide that unpacks that in more detail. But we sought guidelines from the government gazetted schedule on the new National Small Enterprise Act threshold. But I'll unpack that in more detail in the slides to come. Again, just because we had to use something scientific and to help formulate all this. And because with the PSPs, remember, it is not always practically possible to allocate funding based on their market share or throughput, because the different PSPs are involved in many different types of activities. Thank you so much. The next slide, please. The next guidelines, the voluntary members have also been included in the proposed funding model, and they will pay a nominal or a fair amount through a fixed fee because of their limited involvement in the PIB structures. And again, depending on the membership option that they've opted for, it will determine how much they contribute between the basic and the prime. Again, I've got a slide that unpacks this further on. The number 7, the members who have historically not contributed to PASA's assets need to commit to pay an equitable share of the PASA assets that will be transferred to the PIB. Again, I've got another slide that unpacks this in more detail, but it should be in proportion to their annual funding to ensure some level of fair recovery, or another way to look at it is some aspect of seed funding or contribution to the new entity. The PIB will also levy other separate charges, again, through conferences, training, and so forth, which will be charged for separately by to both members and non-members. There's consideration about a one-time admittance fee to be charged to members. And the funding model, though, which is, I think for me, number 10 is probably quite key, or has been quite one of the critical guidelines in informing the funding model, that this funding model, all being said, needs to be very simple. It needs to be transparent. It needs to be easy to communicate, and should be based on inputs and data that is reliable, achievable, practical, and sustainable. In that, members should also be able to the extent possible, be able to replicate some of the formulas and come up with the same result. I see a hand is up. I'll just stop there, and I can't see who it is, but please feel free.
Hello, this is Hendrik. Hi, we haven't met. It's good to see you.
Hi, good to see you.
I just want to ask that whether you have tested the Principle 7 against the requirement that non-profit organizations, which PASA currently is, cannot be repaid to the members, or they may not be compensated. That value at the termination of such an entity need to be passed on to a similar organization, and that legal impediment, which might be an impediment, needs to be checked.
Thank you so much for that question. I'll jump in first, and if any of my other PASA colleagues would like to jump in after me, please feel free to. But we have sought legal and tax guidance with regards to what we can and cannot do. And I'll unpack it further in the slide, but to give you, there's the aspect of the PASA assets will be transferred to the PIB in terms of after PASA has settled all its liabilities and so forth, then the assets move on. The concept that we're unpacking there is really more akin to seed funding in terms of the new members who are historically not members of PASA will be contributing some seed to the new entity. So it's actually broken up into two aspects, from the existing PASA assets that are going to be in existence and therefore transferred to the new PIB entity, as well as some notion of seed funding. And all this, we are working with our tax and legal to ensure that we stay on the right side of both. Okay, Hendrik, but I'll get to it a bit more later. Thanks, Hendrik. Okay. And then just on the last point, being point 11, any reduction with any of the functions moving out of PASA with the new structure once it's set up as the PIB, we will also ensure that there's a reduction in operating expenses to take this into account. So the annual budget itself would be adjusted accordingly. Thank you. So just moving on to the next slide, please. So I'll quickly talk through the different income sources for which is really the total PIB funding. To start off, as we all know, and as Hendrik has just mentioned, the PIB would be a not-for-profit organization. So the intention is not to make any profit, it's pretty much to determine how much is required from a budget perspective, and this is then sourced from the members. So the total member obligation is really split into three parts. There's the annual budget allocation, which is applicable to all the members. There's a bit that I've touched on briefly now with regards to the PASA balance sheet that moves assets that moves to the PIB, as well as any other associated SID funding, which will be captured in Part B, and then Part C, the additional levies that are charged from time to time. The additional levies are the ones that I've mentioned earlier, being training, conferences, access to management information, and so forth, of which these will be charged separately and are not included as part and parcel of the normal budget process, because it's a function of when these are run. Moving on to the next slide, of which I'll unpack those 2 points quite a bit in detail. So that Part A, which I spoke to earlier, which is that annual budget allocation, which is applicable to all members, it will be done in 3 conceptual steps. So the first step, we've got the board, which is the overarching governing body for the PIB. They will approve the total annual budget, which will have undergone a very rigorous process in terms of just all the needs for the PIB from a strategic perspective, from business as usual, keeping the lights on, compliance, governance, and so forth. Members, as mentioned earlier, will be involved in deliberating this budget through the AGM in terms of just testing how reasonable or acceptable the budget will be, due to the fact that the implications are obviously the whole of the PIB is member funded. So that's step 1, approval of that overall overarching budget. Step 2 is to determine the income expected from the voluntary members. The voluntary members, as mentioned earlier, these are the other interested and impacted parties, which will be, of which their membership fees will be based on a basic or a prime membership fee. I'll unpack this a bit further in another slide to come. So we'll remove that portion first. And as mentioned earlier, the discussions are still underway as to the timing for when the voluntary members will be part of this formula, or part of the PIB members. Once that's out, the remaining balance is then allocated to the various members in the different categories. And I'll show you in the slide to come now. And just also mention that the annual budget process with the board and the AGM gives the opportunity to adapt and refine the funding methodology. So every year, one will get the members and the board will get a chance to revisit what we've put forward now and refine it until we get to a point where we've got the most suitable funding model in place. Okay, thank you. The next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, PSPs and voluntary members will be moderated, their contribution or their funding requirements will be moderated for their size. Again, because you've got such different sizes, to apply a one shoe or one formula fits all was not really the most ideal. So we tried to come up with something that's independent, something that's scientific in terms of coming up with the sizing. There was different consideration from asset value, number of employees, etc. And we ended up coming up with this government gazetted Schedule 1. This is for the new National Small Enterprises Act threshold, which defines enterprise sizes for finance and business services. So we've used the one particular to our industry, which is finance and business services. You will note that the thresholds are really split into 3, which is your micro, small, and medium. And so by default, the deduction is that anything above the medium is then deemed large. As you see, we've included in our table. So that we've decided to go for the annual turnover as probably the best and most reliable criteria to use in terms of determining the size. So you will see anything above annual turnover above 85 million is then deemed large, and anything below 7.5 million is deemed micro. So the total annual turnover for this purpose is defined as revenue of the registered entity that's accredited to the South African National Payment System. And it will be based on self-declarations and so forth, because by virtue of the fact that not all the information is necessarily publicly available, we'll work with that which we can access, but for those where we don't have publicly available information, we'll be relying on self-declarations in terms of the turnover, which therefore determines the size. We will be conducting a survey over the PSPs for us to determine the spread, because that will impact our formula, the intricate details with regards to our formula. Okay. I see a comment has just popped up. with regards to, David is saying, regards turnover, with regards to payments, confirming the turnover should be turnover derived from the use of the system. Yes, David, as in it will be turnover based on the revenue that's accredited to the South African National Payment System. So correct.
Yeah, I just want to add a bit to this one though, Cosmo, because the challenge with the PSPs is that their volumes are counted through the banks. You don't see them individually. So if you kind of licensed to do domestic remittances, we have no access to that information. So the systems would include your systems where you do domestic remittances, for example. So we're looking for a level of honesty and people kind of self-attesting to what extent they make revenue out of licensed payments services. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Gita. Minal, next slide, please. Thank you. So next, I will just quickly jump onto funding part A, which is the annual budget allocation. And please note, these are indicative numbers, but it's very important to get a view of the indicative numbers because the principle is one thing, and we need to see what it translates to when we now actually talk about impact on one's pocket, as Maurice mentioned earlier. Quick recap, pricing determinants were we've priced for risk, we've priced for effort, we've priced for value and or gains, which I articulated earlier. This is based on the membership categories that Gita articulated earlier, which is your clearing participants. You will see in the table, we've separated the systematically important ones to the other clearing participants through a dotted line because they're ultimately still in the same category, being clearing participants. We've then got the operators and the PSPs. So the mechanism we've arrived at the fee for the clearing participants is based on a fixed and a variable component, which is built on market share of total throughput. These clearing participants in total, we have a good sense that there'll be 32 because our current membership base, which comprises clearing participants, is 32. So that's what's driving those numbers. Although with the SIs, whether it's the 5, it might be the 6 that the SARB officially recognizes, as Gita mentioned earlier. But based on current pricing, because these clearing participants are currently members, so they're currently actually funding the PASA. Their current membership fees is articulated in the second last column to the right. You see that the systematically important clearing participants pay on average 12.6 million. But that range, again, because we adjusted for volume and value, ranges from 8 million to 15 million. So you could find one member paying 8 million and the 15, but the average in that category is about 12.6 million. We expect in the new funding model that this will reduce to about 11.4 million on average. And the same with other clearing participants, that the range is from 1.2 million currently to about 4.5 million, which is an average of 2 million. This will also drop to an average of 1.8 million from the 27 other clearing participants. The reduction there is because we've now introduced, in the PIB, there's an introduction of new members who will then share some of the costs. So that's hence the reduction. From the market share throughput, what you see on there from the 50%, those are percentages, 50%, 30%, which is 80%, is what is the market throughput for the clearing participants based on what we've computed as it stands, based on the volumes values and what we've got visibility over at this point in time. With regards to the PSOs, the computations you see include the 4 of them, including straight. The average contribution per each participant is computed or forecast to be about 3.2 million. This is really, at this point in time, they're not members, so we don't have a comparison in terms of, for me to be able to show you what that increase will, what they're paying now, because they're paying nothing at the present moment. But we expect they'll be paying about 3.2 million. I just want to re-emphasize the point mentioned earlier that the funding model is a 2-step process. There's the principle, which I'm highlighting now in terms of that's contributed to us coming up with the models, formula, etc. But we will rerun these numbers once we've got actual visibility on what that budget should look like on day one, the TOM, the number of licensed entities, and so forth, particularly when we look at the PSPs. Because in this computation, one has used about between 250 to 350 members, but this number could look different. So based on that, estimated number of 250 to 350 members for the PSPs, we anticipate that on average, each one will contribute about 43,000, compared to the 12,000 that some of the TPPs or SOs are currently paying at the moment. In terms of market throughput, we think PSPs is about 10% and PSOs another 10%, which makes up the 100% of the market throughput. Every year when we review the budget, we will reconsider all this. All this will be reviewed annually as part of the annual budget process. This is quite a meaty slide, so I just want to stop for a moment to ask if anybody's got questions on this piece. But I'll take it that there are none, and thank you so much. We'll move on to the next slide. Oh, Hendrik, sorry. I see your hand up, Hendrik.
I just want to check because your number of 43,000 for the PSPs must have been calculated on a single number, and I take it that's the midpoint of 300.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Okay. So just moving on to the step 2, which is indicative funding from other interested or impacted parties, which we term the voluntary members. You know, these are the associations or other entities that will volunteer to be members within the PIB. As mentioned earlier, there are 2 types of memberships that we've come up with. There's the basic membership, which is really for information benefits only. So this is where you sign up basic membership, you pay the nominal amount depending on your size. So if you're a micro voluntary member and you want basic membership, you'll pay anything between 1,500 to 2,500. If you're large, you'll pay anything from 8,500 to 12,000 for basic membership. But if you want prime membership, or if the organization is interested in prime membership, this is then, it comes at an extra cost per each area of involvement or per each additional payment stream. And to recap, the payment streams are the ones articulated in the earlier presentation, where we put them into categories being the low value debits, the low value credits, the high value credits, and cards. So it's pretty much based on each payment stream. There you will pay, the entity will pay a fixed pricing of between 50,000 to 100,000 per area of involvement. I just want to articulate that one has had to put forward ranges. You know, that's why it's from between 50,000 and 100,000. The exact number, that's ballpark, to say it should be within that range. The exact number will finalize, as mentioned earlier, as part of the step 2, when we've got a good view of the budget and the required funding from all our different members. So on this slide, I think it is quite self-explanatory. Again, we'll review every 12 to 24 months. But yeah, on this, if there are no questions on that, now I think we can move forward to the next slide.
I think just one question from my side on the previous slide. How do we define whether an organization is small, medium, and large? Is there any guidance pertaining to that?
Okay, Manel, if you could just go back to the tape, I think one up. Yeah. So yeah, sorry, you go one down. Yeah. Okay. So the table that we've used is this schedule here, which is organization size for medium, small, and micro, which is really a government gazetted one, which is the threshold that the government uses for finance and business services. So we've used that as a good independent view or criteria to use. So again, it's based on total turnover, based on those parameters.
Okay, no, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Manel, I think we were on fund. The next slide, please. So I'll now move on to the fair value share allocation of PASA assets. This is an updated slide to better articulate the point from earlier. So in terms of this, it's pretty much looking at the considerations for deciding the recovery of the fair value of PASA assets. So there are two key things to take into account. The PASA will cease to be and move up, and all its assets, it will pay up all its liabilities and so forth based on the requirements, the current constitution as part of dissolving or transferring into a new entity, the new entity being the PIB. So there will be some assets when at that D-Day when PASA becomes PIB. And so those assets will be moved, transferred across to the new entity. We're working very hard to make sure that we actually reduce that balance sheet or those assets from one entity to the other, so that it doesn't raise any complications. But then there will be some assets that do need to be transferred into the new entity. Members, the logic behind it, or the considerations have been that members who have not historically contributed to those assets need to contribute some sort of seed funding to the new entity, instead of asking everybody to contribute capital or seed funding. The seed funding from current members and through the existing assets that are in PASA transferring to PIB are deemed seed funding from existing members, and the new members will need to contribute some level of seed funding. Of which we've, in the spirit of reducing barriers to entry, we've looked at very flexible ways to do this, of which the contribution will be covered over a number of years and not just a once-off, etc. I'll look at the comments just now, just closing the slide, and I'll come back to you. This contribution portion should be determined on the same basis as the annual funding allocations. So, for instance, where we've said it's 10% for funding, that same bit is what we've used in the formula to determine exactly how much. There's another slide after this which shows you the numbers and hopefully better articulates it. Okay. So the member categories liable for seed funding, if I can call it that, would be the PSOs, the PSPs, and the other interested or impacted parties, just because those are the new members in the PIB. If I can please move on to the next slide. Okay, so the slides referred to, or maybe I can just quickly look at the comments. So,
so I think, Cosmo, I've dealt with all of them except the last ones from David, which is the thinking on the fair value measurement of the assets in terms of the useful life of what's to be transferred. So I think it might just be worth talking about what actually sits on the balance sheet.
Okay, yeah, David, I believe this next slide will answer your question, but if it doesn't, please keep me honest, and then I'll come back to your question. The indicative balance sheet that will be transferred from PASA to the PIB would be about between 20 million and 30 million based on our current projections. The fair value or the seed funding contribution, as mentioned, should be aligned to the proportion contribution to the overall funding. So all the new members, because if you recall on the previous table, we had the table which showed all the clearing participants, of which the SIs were 50% and the other clearing participants 30%. So 80% of the funding will be from the existing members. So 20% only will be required from the new members in the PIB. So we then take 20% of the balance sheet or the assets to be transferred. And this works out to be between 4 and 6 million expected. This is 4 and 6 million amongst all the new members. This is the 250 to 350 PSPs plus the 4, we're talking hundreds basically. So the average cost, and in this computation, though, I've just used 250 and not the 300, just again to be more prudent, I've used 250 instead of 300. So if we divide that per member, it means that each one will be paying anything between 15,000 and 24,000 based on that balance sheet of portion of 4 to 6 million. There's an option to pay this upfront, a one-time admittance fee paid in year 1, and that's it. You've paid the 15,000 as an example, and that's it, addressing this seed funding or this contribution to the PIB. However, in an effort to avoid barriers to entry, we've given the option for payment over 5 years. And the thinking is that after 5 years, this seed contribution or seed funding has been paid up and we close that chapter and it's done. So should a member join midway, a new member join midway through the 5 years, we'll just prorate it. So if you join in year 2, it means 80% of this amount over the remaining 3 years. But after the 5 years, it's definitely closed off. So the average recruitment, should an entity choose to pay this over 5 years through a payment plan, would be anything between 3,000 and 5,000 Rand per year. The repayment options, again, we've tried very hard to be flexible and accommodating. They can be the full payment upfront, as mentioned earlier. This is the 15,000 to 24,000, and then the entity enjoys the full membership rights. And then one can opt to pay over 5 years over the payment plan, as indicated, the 3,000 to 5,000, and then enjoy the full membership rights, or make no payment towards the balance sheet at all. You know, don't pay anything on that, but continue to pay the annual membership subscriptions as determined on that previous table shown earlier with indicative numbers. And then after the full recoupment has been made or seed fund contribution has been made, then one is then entitled to their full membership rights. I'll pause a bit on that one so that, because again, I know it's a bit of a, some ins and outs and so forth. But long and short, we've tried to, the intention is to make sure that those, as the seed contribution is minimal. The indication or the guideline we've used to determine what that seed contribution will be is pretty much the assets transferred to the PIB. All right. If there are any questions on this piece before I pick up Alistair's one, I think he's talking about the voluntary members, but just to close off this piece before I pick up Alistair's comments.
Yeah, so Alistair's association proposed that that only associations should be entitled to the Prime membership. We took that to the design team. I think, Alistair, as per the note, we probably dropped you. And there was a very strong view that there are a number of parties who are not part of associations, but who are significantly involved in the payment system, who would be disadvantaged by that approach. And therefore, in keeping with the way we've done pretty much everything, we try to keep it as inclusive as possible. What we have done, and we haven't shared yet with the community, is we've proposed entry criteria for the voluntary members, which includes certain categories of activities and some due diligence, which would be largely akin to what you would get in a KYC world, because presumably licensing would do due diligence on members, but voluntary members who are unlicensed wouldn't have gone through that. So we've taken note of your concern and proposed putting in controls to deal with the concern, but to try and remain as inclusive as possible. I don't want to spend more time on this one, given that the purpose of today is training rather than debate. And maybe we can take it up offline, or we can raise it in the next consultation forum.
Thank you, Gita. Thank you, Alistair. If there are no questions on this one, can we move on to the next slide, please? So the next is the last slide under funding and other obligations. And this really unpacks the other obligations of the membership categories. So you'll see we've got reporting obligations that we'll put forward for the different members. We've got commitment of resources, and we've got compliance obligations. And these are pretty much the same across all the different membership categories, where under reporting obligations, we do require members to provide information in the format requested and within the requested time or deadlines put forward to them. Obviously, this is because it feeds into a chain, and it allows us to then be able to take, to use data as submitted to ensure that we meet our own reporting requirements as the PIB. We expect the members to commit some resources, resources that are adequately skilled and mandated representatives into the structures that they participate in. And from a compliance ask, we do ask that they meet, all the different members meet the requirements of rules as set by the PIB. As mentioned, this is really across all the different categories. There is one change where at some point we considered whether voluntary members might have different reporting obligations, but after due consideration, the same requirements would be required for all members with regards to all the different obligations as mentioned. So that's the last bit under other obligations. I don't know if there are any questions. If there are none, I'll hand back to Maritz. Thank you, everybody.
Right, before we step off funding, any last thoughts, any last questions perhaps in this regard? No hands, right. I think then we are moving towards the last section actually, and let's try to bring this to life now, and give it some color. So I've selected a ecology of actors. And you will see there's actually 11 of these personas that we've developed. On the next slide, Manel. I'm not going to go through all of those. I'm going to just go through a few of them, but they might all be related to a particular payments activity. So that's why I say it's a set of actors related to a particular payments activity. And I'm going to first start with profile D, Manal, that's the bureau. If you can switch to that, find us that slide. While Manal is scrolling to the right slide, so this is the first actor then. Now this is a PSP. They participate in the payment stream in the form of, they sit somewhere between corporate companies or businesses. They collect on their behalf or provide a collection service on their behalf. They connect on the other side to sponsoring banks. Obviously, it's attractive for businesses to use this PSP because they do get the users better transaction fees. And on top of that, they also provide additional value-adding services. In this case, let's assume, let's play, they adding value in the form of reconciliation services. So the first question is, what is their membership and membership requirement? Now, it's clear a PSP will be licensed, so this entity will be licensed by definitely the SARB, but because there might be potential direct consumer interfaces, it might even be that it's the SARB together with the FSC, the Financial Services, the FSCA. Now, let's look at how they then participate. Obviously, the areas of interest for them in the payment streams that the participants paid in very strongly would be EFT debits and also debit check. So the first point to make is they will not be involved in the rule-making aspects around EFT debits or debit check, either of them. They won't have voting rights related to rulemaking, but they will be consulted because they are a significant player, and in how the rulemaking structures will work, they will be consulted with regards to any rules or changes to rules or any proposals on rule harmonization. What is interesting now in what I'm presenting here is how these ecologies actually very strongly depend on associations. So now let's look at their participation in a Stratco. Now remember, the Stratco is the body of about 30 people or 30 entities represented through people that basically would look after the interests of the low value debits environment. Now, in this case, the bureau company potentially do not directly participate themselves, but they've chosen SEBA to be the representative on the Stratco because SEBA also represent a number of other company similar to bureau company. And they all find comfort in the fact that we don't have to jostle for a seat at the Stratco. SIBA will represent us there, and they will bring everything back to us, and we will have our consultations and sessions in the SIBA sphere to actually discuss any of these strategic implications or consequences of what has been decided there. Now, let's look at how they participate in project structures. So there could be a project that, for instance, looks at the harmonization of rules. And it could be that bureau company is very interested in this and therefore have chosen to directly participate. Because in this instance, again, play. In this instance, SIBA is agreed that bureau company actually represents SIBA in this space. Bureau company is then actually the face that you will see at this particular or in this particular project team. They represent a broader group of people. Now, it's also possible that a PSP can participate in the other strategy forums that is looking at broader topics, overarching payment strategy, some of the overlay services that could affect any of the payment streams or run across payment streams. And in this case, let's say they are very interested in open banking. But in this case, they've decided that SIBA and the chair of SIBA will represent them in an open banking strategy task team. So that's just kind of an indication of how they could participate in structures with many assumptions and really just how hypothetically and as an example. More important though, let's look at governance and funding now. Because they are a mandated member, they would be required to fund the budget of the PIB. Cosmo spoke to the fact that it is very difficult for a bureau's transactions and volumes and value to actually be tracked. So they will basically participate in the funding based on a broad turnover category. Let's say in this case, they are a fairly large bureau, collections bureau, and therefore in funding they will pay membership fees above the average for PSPs. Okay, governance. I actually switched funding and governance around, so let's just jump to governance then. So first of all, let's think about the AGM and the selection of independent board members. Everybody on the AGM has a right to vote with regards to independent board members. But over and above that, they also have the right to, on behalf of their constituency. Now, remember in the proposal, there's 3 seats allocated for OIIPs and PSPs together. Now, they can then also elect the independent board members for that category, and that's only this constituency, together with the OIIPs, that will elect those 3 seats. So they would participate in the election of the board members for their constituency. So that is then governance as well. So that is one part of the equation. Now let's look at the user that is being served by bureau company. If you can skip Manel to, let me just quickly look. It is persona G. Slide 134. There we go. So this is now a collections user. So they on the demand side of this payments process. They're the ones that actually use the services, and they also use bureau company. So let's say in this case, they're a fairly large insurance company, but they decided this insurance company to collect through the bureau. They have interest in DebiCheck. They've just recently introduced it. They're looking for opportunities to influence what is happening in DebiCheck in terms of enhancements, further build, and so on. So membership requirements then, if we can deal with that as the first element here. And here we must now remember they are not mandated to become a member. So they're not a licensed party in the payments environment by the SARB. Therefore, their membership needs to be a voluntary membership. Now, according to the proposals as we've developed it so far, that is possible that an individual entity can sign up as a member for voluntary membership, in other words, in the OIIP, other interested and impacted parties category. Over and above this, they have the choice to sign up for either basic membership or prime membership. Now, prime membership will be paid due to the fact that they have a special interest in a particular payment system and want a little bit more than the usual information flows in this space. Now, this particular member has decided to sign up for prime membership. They're very interested in what happens in DebiCheck and so on, and therefore it is possible for them to receive that kind of membership. Now let's look at how they will be represented in member structures. Okay, so the first thing is, again, they won't be involved in the rule-making processes themselves, but once again, because they've opted for prime membership, will be consulted with regards to any changes or anything that impacts from the rule-making environment potentially on their businesses, and the input will be taken back to the rule-making structure, but they haven't got voting rights on that rule-making structure. It's possible that they also directly participate in the project, but let's assume in this case through the representative organization, because there's a number of other companies similar to themselves that wants to influence what's happening in this space. Now, in this case, they've decided to use ASISA as the platform. They all are members of ASISA as well. And ASISA is then the entity sitting on the project steerco and taking their input and perspectives back into the project steerco. Funding obligations, they are then obviously a voluntary member. There's a standard basic fee for them to pay, and if they opt for prime membership, they need to pay that. But it needs to be underlined that this is a voluntary process. So it's a voluntary selection to become prime in the low value debit space, and therefore that adds to their funding contribution or their funding. Let's then lastly look at governance. How would they participate in governance? They could individually be part of an AGM, and they would then, as a single entity, as a single organization, be able to vote in the categories that they for that constituency. In other words, for other interested and impacted party. That means they can vote for the election of independent members, and they can also vote for any board member that is elected, and that comes from the OIIP, and in this case combined with the PSPs, they can put forward and elect 3 board members. So that's then the individual company. Now let's move on to their association. Now in this case, let's pick on a user association that represents the insurance industry then. This user association, again, is not required to be licensed, therefore not a mandatory member, but a voluntary member. It may again be the case that because of the exceptional interest in collection systems, debit check and EFTs, that they are now additionally opting for Prime membership, and that would add to their funding. Let's then look at how they participate. They would participate in certain structures. First of all, again, to point out, they would not be able to participate directly on rule-making structures, but they would be consulted because of their Prime membership with regards to all rule-making activities and how it impacts them, and their inputs will be taken back to those structures to consider. It is possible then that they can represent the constituency in various other structures. So let's take the Stratco. It is very possible in that group of 30 people that are this user association, let's say it's ASISA, that they represent a broad group of individual stakeholders in where we are going to go with regards to this particular payments environment, this payment system, or the series of payment systems represented in the low value debit space. So it's possible that they then participate in the Stratco. It is also then possible that they participate in specific projects to further enhance the systems that they are interested in. They could be the appointed individuals in the seats set aside in this project steerco for non-banks to participate in the project. Let's look at then the funding requirements. I think it's obvious at this stage. It would be a basic fee, and then because of the option to also take up Prime membership, they pay an additional fee for the payment system that they are interested in, the broad payments area that they are interested in. Their participation in governance, so they can again at the AGM be part of the selection of independent board members, and they can also participate in the voting of board members elected from their constituency. And remember again, the constituency is a combination of PSPs and OIIPs. They would, as an OIIP, as a voluntary member, they are part of the OIIP category, and they together can select 3 board members. So the last one then is, let's look at a bank very briefly. If you can go to ABC Bank, which is on page 137. So let's say this is a very large bank. Because of their size, there's settlement and operational risks if any of their systems are going down. So they are recognized by the SARB to be a systemically important clearing participant. That's the kind of license that they are carrying or being given, and they then become a mandatory member as a systemically important clearing system participant. They obviously then have the right to participate in the rulemaking and the regulatory structure, where they've got full voting rights. They, however, have to consult with regards to any of the rules that has been developed or derived on that structure with the non-banks. They are also part of Stratcos and other structures, like for instance the risk structures, etc. And they obviously participate in projects and in project steering committees, and could participate also in other strat committees that considers the future of payments or new payments trends and some of these things. Again, let me deal with funding obligations first, there at the bottom. So together with other systemically important banks and other clearing banks, the smaller ones, they contribute to roughly 80% of the funding. This is derived very, let's call it then almost mathematically, through looking at first of all, a fixed fee of the kind of the number of payment systems that they participate in, for which they each pay a fixed fee, and then additionally a variable fee that is different from bank to bank, systemically important or small, based on the throughput. So both volume, but also value. And that is kind of counting more or less 50-50, or weighing 50-50. So with that kind of derive then, that brings you to the total funding contribution. They would then participate in governance in the following way. First of all, again, they can select or are part of the selection of independent directors at the AGM, but for their own constituency, which is in the latest proposal 4 seats allocated to systemically important banks, they are involved in the nomination and final election then of whoever serves on the board then for those in those 4 seats for systemically important banks. So I think this is just an example to show you how these things can come to life. You know, there's a lot of detail to sort out, but the moment you start to tell the story to yourself about how these things kind of fit together, how would you think about an association, a bureau, a bank? I think the picture comes together. So I hope with that we are more or less through everything. And again, you know, my comment this morning was this is really for orientation, to orientate yourself. I hope it helped you with your orientation. I'm handing over to Geeta to close out for us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Moritz. And I think it's quite important to note in terms of Moritz's comments on orientation, that if we look at slide 127, please, Manal, we've done this exercise for a long list of different parties, and obviously we only covered a couple of them today because of time, but we think that we've probably caught most categories of parties who are choosing to be involved in this, including some who obviously, like a small independent restaurant, don't have any involvement. So again, to Moritz's point, engage, and please just shout if you've got any questions or comments. Megan, the slides will be available from today, and the recordings will also be made available. We'll get to that in a minute. We've allowed time, and I think we still have sufficient time if there are any remaining questions, although we have taken questions during the course of the training as well. I just want to remind everybody that the funding pack we went through today will go out for final sign-off. We covered very clearly where elements of the membership will also have to be finalized and go out for final sign-off. And those are probably the 2 remaining areas that need to be resolved in order to close out on the design process. At this point, I'm going to open up for general questions, so please feel free to raise your hand or to type in the comment section. And while people are thinking about that, maybe, Manal, let's just look at the closeout slide. So This content will be circulated, but we're also going to make a recording of today's session available. We're not going to split it into categories, but we'll put times against each category so you can choose when to join in the conversation. We also have other material that's available for you already on the PASA website. So all the signed off content is actually available for download on our website. And then recordings from the case studies that we did a couple of weeks back. So DG Naidu's and Herman's case study on the telco industry, as well as his original culture presentation, are available. And we are targeting the 30th of June to hopefully present the finalized material. David, in terms of your question, you hit the crux of the problem perfectly, because depending what payment stream and what type of role you play in that payment stream, the values and volumes that translate into revenue are too difficult for us to calculate. And that's why we went with the self-attestation for the PSPs and the other interested and impacted parties, because we just couldn't figure out a way to make that link. But if you've got any clever, simple to implement ideas for us, we would be grateful. Yeah, that's exactly the heart of the issue. I don't know if there are any.
Can I just add to that and related to David's question? We must understand some of the potential players in this space would provide some other service with transaction as a basis, but it's not a direct transaction flow. So it might be the resolution of a QR code or something like that. And it makes it very, very difficult to actually work with transaction or transaction numbers, volume, value, or any of those aspects to get to a membership fee or to get to the funding. Therefore, I think the point Gita also make, and we need to kind of amplify that point, is we'll have to rely on yourself at the station to say, I'm a big player, I'm a medium player, and so on in this space. Therefore, then there's a fixed fee then calculated for a medium player or for a large player, and that will be your membership contribution.
Good. I'm not seeing any more hands or questions, but obviously this isn't your last chance. You can always drop us a note, come via the PIB project office. And we look forward to engaging with many of you in hopefully closing out the final material over the next couple of weeks. But thank you very much for attending this morning. We hope it's been useful, and as I say, we will make the content and the material available. Thank you, everyone.